It was one of the boldest and most dangerous plots of the Second World War, an attempt not to win the war on the battlefield, but to end it from within the very heart of Nazi Germany. In the summer of 1944, as the Reich crumbled under Allied advances, a group of German officers, politicians and resistance figures took an unimaginable risk. They called it Operation Valkyrie, a plan to assassinate Adolf Hitler, seize control of the government, and negotiate peace before Germany was utterly destroyed. But this was not the work of outside enemies. These were men who had once sworn loyalty to the regime, now turning against it, driven by a moral reckoning with the crimes of war and the devastation brought upon their homeland. The central figure, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, stood at the crossroads of duty and conscience. With only one hand and one eye left from the battlefield, he carried a briefcase containing not reports or orders, but a bomb meant to change the course of history. This documentary takes you deep into the tension, the secrecy, and the courage of the Valkyrie conspirators. We will retrace the origins of the German resistance, explore the inner circle of officers who risked everything, and follow the plan step by step from the planting of the explosive at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to the desperate hours in Berlin when conspirators tried to seize power before the truth emerged. You will hear how fate, chance, and a single, moved briefcase decided the outcome, not only of Operation Valkyrie, but of millions of lives still trapped in the war's final inferno. And you will witness how, even in the darkest moments of tyranny, individuals dared to say no, choosing conscience over obedience, even when the price was death. This is more than a story of a failed coup. It is a story of courage, betrayal, and the fragile line between success and catastrophe. It is the story of what happens when men inside the regime itself tried to stop it from within. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always amazing to see this global community connecting across time zones, keeping history alive, and remembering the people who tried to alter its course. Now, let us step into the shadows of July 20th, 1944, and uncover the entire history of Operation Valkyrie. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he encountered not unanimous support, but currents of quiet resistance within Germany itself. Many conservatives in the military and government distrusted him, seeing him as a reckless populist rather than a disciplined statesman. Among aristocratic officers of the Prussian tradition, there lingered a disdain for the Bohemian corporal, a man they felt lacked the pedigree to lead a nation. Civil servants, particularly in the Foreign Office, worried that Hitler's aggression would isolate Germany from the international community. Church leaders feared the Nazi obsession with racial ideology would corrupt moral order and undermine Christian teachings. Intellectuals, writers, and artists found themselves silenced by censorship, yet in private circles they shared doubts about the regime. But Hitler's consolidation of power through intimidation, propaganda, and purges stifled these early whispers of opposition. Fear of the Gestapo and the allure of Nazi success in the 1930s ensured that most voices stayed hidden. Yet beneath the surface, seeds of doubt were planted. These seeds would eventually grow into plots aimed at Hitler's very life. Within the German military, discontent began to stir even in the earliest years of Hitler's rule. Generals respected his ability to restore pride to the armed forces, defying the Treaty of Versailles by rearming Germany, yet they worried that his ambitions stretched too far, too quickly, risking disaster. Senior officers like General Ludwig Beck, chief of the General Staff in the 1930s, warned that Hitler's plans for expansion could plunge Germany into a catastrophic war. Beck foresaw the imbalance of resources between Germany and its potential enemies, particularly Britain, France, and eventually the United States. His memoranda, though ignored by Hitler, circulated quietly among skeptical officers. Others, such as General Werner von Fritsch and Admiral Wilhelm Canaris of the Abwehr, shared similar reservations. These men were not democratic liberals. They were conservatives steeped in tradition, but their instincts told them Hitler's recklessness would doom Germany. In their caution lay the earliest sparks of military opposition. Their unease foreshadowed the eventual emergence of organized conspiracies. Among civilians, another layer of resistance arose from moral and religious conviction. The Catholic Church and the Protestant Confessing Church both struggled against Nazi intrusion into spiritual life. Pastors like Martin Niemöller and theologians such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood against the attempt to replace Christianity with the idolatry of race and Führer. Bonhoeffer, in particular, became a central figure, condemning the persecution of Jews and the corruption of faith. His courage brought him into contact with conspirators within the military and intelligence services, bridging religious dissent with political opposition. Ordinary believers resisted more quietly, hiding Jewish neighbors, distributing forbidden sermons, or refusing to participate in Nazi rituals. Each act of conscience carried immense risk, as the Gestapo's reach extended into every parish and pew. Yet these men and women kept alive the moral argument against the regime. They reminded others that resistance was not only political, but spiritual. In the crucible of dictatorship, faith became a weapon of defiance. Business leaders and bureaucrats, too, harbored early doubts about Hitler's direction. Some feared that his economic policies, while spectacular in their early results, were unsustainable. Others recoiled at the regime's brutal treatment of Jews, which disrupted commerce and drove talented professionals into exile. Conservative politicians like Karl Gauder, the former mayor of Leipzig, criticized the persecution of minorities and the destruction of law. Gauder would later emerge as a central civilian conspirator in Operation Valkyrie, but his journey began in these early years of unease. He cultivated quiet networks among fellow conservatives who hoped to preserve Germany's honor without Hitler's fanaticism. These circles, though small, provided an alternative vision for the nation, one rooted in tradition, law, and international respect. In this way, opposition slowly extended beyond the barracks and churches, reaching into offices and boardrooms. The Nazi state's totalitarian grip limited open dissent, but beneath the surface discontent grew. These scattered individuals would one day converge in a conspiracy to end the tyranny. The turning point for many doubters came not in speeches or ideology, but in Hitler's actions abroad. The reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936 and the annexation of Austria in 1938 emboldened him, convincing millions that his gambles brought victory. But for skeptics like Ludwig Beck and other officers, the Munich crisis revealed the danger of Hitler's brinkmanship. Beck resigned in protest in 1938, unwilling to endorse the reckless march toward war with Czechoslovakia. His resignation marked one of the first high-profile acts of defiance within the Nazi elite. Though he left office quietly, Beck became a symbol for those who recognized that Germany's destiny could not remain tied to Hitler's madness. Each aggressive move by Hitler deepened the divide between blind followers and cautious skeptics. In the shadows of triumph, opposition gained quiet strength. Hitler's apparent invincibility only sharpened the urgency of stopping him. By the late 1930s, resistance had roots that ran deeper than whispers. As war broke out in 1939, opposition circles faced both new urgency and new danger. The early victories in Poland, France, and the Low Countries silenced many critics who saw Hitler as a military genius. But those who understood the imbalance of resources recognized that Germany's triumphs could not last. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of military intelligence, covertly warned contacts abroad of Hitler's ambitions, even as he outwardly served the regime. Henning von Treschow, a brilliant staff officer on the Eastern Front, became convinced that Hitler's war was criminal and unwinnable. These men began plotting not only resistance but assassination, reasoning that Hitler himself was the root of disaster. In these early war years, plots failed to mature, stifled by Hitler's aura of success. Yet the conspirators continued to gather, their networks expanding with each passing month. The more Hitler advanced, the more they feared the catastrophe of his eventual defeat. Opposition was no longer about politics alone. It became about saving Germany from ruin. The human cost of Hitler's policies further fueled opposition. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 unleashed atrocities that shocked even hardened officers. Reports of mass executions of Jews and civilians filtered back from the Eastern Front, carried by men like Treschow, who saw the Wehrmacht implicated in crimes against humanity. Some resisted out of sheer revulsion, believing that Germany's honor was being dragged into the mud of genocide. Others resisted because they saw these policies as strategically disastrous, ensuring the hatred of conquered populations and the mobilization of global enemies. In both cases, the realization was the same. Hitler's regime was not only immoral, but suicidal. Religious leaders like Bonhoeffer condemned these actions from the pulpit and the underground. Conservative officials like Gödel argued that Germany's very survival depended on ending the Nazi nightmare. Each atrocity became a fresh argument for urgent action. The seeds of resistance now sprouted in the blood-soaked soil of occupied Europe. By the early 1940s, Germany contained a mosaic of resistance, fragmented, cautious but real. There were conservative politicians seeking lawful governance, military officers fearing strategic ruin, clergy protesting moral corruption, and civilians resisting in quiet acts of courage. Their ideologies differed, their goals varied, but they shared one conclusion: Adolf Hitler must be stopped. The challenge was monumental, for the Gestapo crushed dissent, and Hitler's popularity remained high after military victories. Yet conspirators began to find each other, weaving threads of opposition into networks of trust. Meetings took place in private homes, embassies, and staff offices, guarded by secrecy and coded words. Slowly, a vision emerged of not just resisting, but removing Hitler altogether. These earliest seeds would grow into the boldest conspiracy of the war, Operation Valkyrie. In the shadows of dictatorship, a plan was beginning to take shape. The seeds of resistance were ready to bear their dangerous fruit. When Adolf Hitler assumed the office of Chancellor in January 1933, Germany was still a fragile democracy, its institutions battered by economic crisis and political violence. Within months, Hitler and his allies in the Nazi Party began dismantling the Weimar Republic with ruthless precision. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 gave the Nazis the pretext to issue the Reichstag Fire Decree, suspending civil liberties under the guise of protecting public safety. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly vanished almost overnight, replaced by arrests of political opponents. The Social Democrats and Communists, once powerful forces in German politics, were outlawed and driven underground. Trade unions were dissolved, their leaders imprisoned, and workers forced into the Nazi-controlled German Labour Front. By July 1933, the Enabling Act had transformed Hitler's government into a dictatorship, granting him the power to rule by decree without parliamentary oversight. The Weimar Republic was dead, its legal framework twisted into a weapon of repression. From that moment on, dissent could no longer be expressed in parliaments or newspapers. It could survive only in whispers, shadows, and conspiracies. The consolidation of power was not only political but cultural. extending into every aspect of German life. The Nazi regime unleashed a flood of propaganda, overseen by Joseph Goebbels, who transformed radio, film, and print into instruments of indoctrination. Posters depicted Hitler as Germany's savior, while loudspeakers blared his speeches in factories, schools, and public squares. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify the Führer, racial pseudoscience, and militarism. Youth organizations like the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls trained the next generation in unquestioning loyalty. Dissenting voices, writers, artists, intellectuals, were silenced through censorship or exile. Book burnings eradicated un-German literature, while modernist art was condemned as degenerate. In this atmosphere of conformity, resistance became almost unthinkable. To oppose Hitler was not merely political disobedience, but a rejection of a society saturated in Nazi ideology. By monopolizing culture, the regime created a reality in which alternatives seemed impossible. The shadows deepened, and within them only a few dared to resist. Terror was the backbone of Hitler's dictatorship, embodied in the Gestapo and the SS. The Gestapo operated as a secret police force with unchecked powers, infiltrating homes, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Informants were everywhere. Colleagues, neighbors, even family members could denounce one another, often to settle personal grudges. The fear of denunciation eroded trust, isolating individuals and preventing organized resistance from taking root. Arrests were sudden, often without formal charges, and interrogations were brutal, relying on torture to extract confessions. Those accused of political crimes were sent to concentration camps like Dachau, which from 1933 onward became laboratories of repression. The SS expanded its control, creating a parallel state apparatus that answered directly to Heinrich Himmler and ultimately Hitler. Rule of law was replaced by rule of fear, where justice no longer protected citizens but served the regime. In such an atmosphere, silence became the safest choice, and silence became complicity. Terror was not an accident, but a deliberate tool of control. Hitler's dictatorship was built on fear as much as ideology. The Night of the Long Knives in June 1934 demonstrated Hitler's willingness to eliminate not only external enemies, but internal rivals. In a swift purge, the SS assassinated Ernst Röhm and other leaders of the Sturmabteilung SA, along with conservative critics, like former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher. The killings, justified as a defense against a supposed coup, sent shockwaves through Germany. The message was clear: no one, not even those within the Nazi movement, was safe from Hitler's wrath. The army, reassured by the removal of the unruly SA, pledged its loyalty to Hitler personally. When President Paul von Hindenburg died shortly afterward, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, proclaiming himself Führer. The oath of loyalty, sworn by every soldier to Hitler personally, cemented his hold over the military, leaving generals bound not to the nation but to the man. Opposition within the army was thus suffocated before it could take shape. Yet seeds of doubt still lingered among officers who saw the danger of this absolute power. For the moment, though, dictatorship reigned unchallenged. The courts and legal institutions, once pillars of the Weimar Republic, were transformed into instruments of Nazi power. Judges loyal to the regime filled benches, while laws were rewritten to criminalize opposition and normalize discrimination. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship and legal rights, embedding anti-Semitism into the legal code. Political trials became spectacles, where verdicts were foregone conclusions and defendants humiliated before being sentenced. The notorious People's Court, presided over by Roland Freisler, epitomized this perversion of justice, turning trials into propaganda performances. Freisler shouted down defendants, ridiculed them, and handed out death sentences with theatrical fury. Justice in Nazi Germany no longer meant fairness or protection, it meant submission to the will of Hitler. Lawyers who resisted were silenced, imprisoned, or forced into exile. The judiciary's transformation closed yet another avenue for dissent. The state itself had become an accomplice to dictatorship. Resistance now had no legal framework in which to operate. Only clandestine networks could survive. The crushing of organized political opposition was relentless and thorough. The Communist Party and Social Democratic Party were outlawed, their leaders imprisoned or executed. Trade unions, once powerful voices for workers, were absorbed into the Nazi-controlled German Labour Front, erasing any independent labour movement. Political exiles attempted to continue the struggle from abroad, but their voices could not reach the masses inside Germany. Underground networks existed, but Gestapo infiltration ensured that they were constantly dismantled. Every attempt at coordinated resistance was crushed with brutal efficiency. Even small gatherings became dangerous, as suspicion and surveillance penetrated daily life. The regime left no space for political pluralism or debate, and opposition figures found themselves increasingly isolated. Resistance thus shifted from public movements to private circles, where secrecy was paramount. Those who still dreamed of another Germany had to operate in whispers and shadows. The dictatorship had eradicated visible dissent, but it could not extinguish discontent entirely. The atmosphere of fear created profound psychological effects, conditioning society to accept or ignore repression. Propaganda painted dissenters as traitors, criminals, or enemies of the people, justifying their arrest or execution. The public, fearful of being associated with resistance, learned to look away as neighbors vanished in the night. At the same time, Nazi successes in foreign policy, the Anschluss with Austria, the annexation of Czechoslovakia, and the early victories of World War II, created a sense of inevitability around Hitler's rule. Opposition seemed futile, while compliance seemed safe. Many Germans convinced themselves that silence was survival, even as they became complicit in the regime's crimes. Yet amid this silence, small pockets of resistance persisted, waiting for the moment when the dictatorship might falter. Hitler's iron grip created the illusion of total control, but beneath it simmered resentment and doubt. These undercurrents would one day feed into conspiracies like Operation Valkyrie. For now, however, the shadow of dictatorship suffocated all light. By the time war erupted in 1939, Hitler's dictatorship appeared unassailable. Political parties were eliminated, unions absorbed, churches intimidated, and the military bound by oath to the Führer. The Gestapo's reach extended into every home, while propaganda flooded every medium, shaping thought and behavior. Opposition had been forced underground, fragmented and isolated, but not extinguished. The seeds planted by military skeptics, religious leaders, and conservative officials remained buried under layers of fear. It would take the disasters of war, the atrocities of the Holocaust, and the courage of individuals like Claus von Stauffenberg to bring those seeds into the open. The environment of dictatorship explains why Operation Valkyrie was so perilous and why so many earlier plots failed. The conspirators faced not only Hitler, but the entire machinery of a totalitarian state. Yet even in this atmosphere, men and women found the courage to resist. The shadow of dictatorship was deep, but in its darkness, the flickers of rebellion began to glow. By the winter of 1942-1943, the aura of Hitler's invincibility, carefully cultivated through years of triumph, began to crumble under the weight of military disaster. The once celebrated Führer, whose bold gambles had led to the rapid conquest of Poland, France, and much of Europe, was now increasingly viewed by his generals as reckless and blind to reality. The turning point came at Stalingrad, where Hitler's refusal to allow the Sixth Army to retreat condemned nearly 300,000 men to encirclement and destruction. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who had hoped for flexibility in command, was forced into submission, ultimately surrendering in February 1943. The shock reverberated through the Wehrmacht, shattering the illusion that Hitler's intuition was infallible. Officers who had once admired his daring began to see his rigidity as disastrous. Stalingrad symbolized not just defeat, but betrayal, the sacrifice of an entire army on the altar of Hitler's pride. Many officers felt their loyalty had been exploited for a doomed cause. The seeds of rebellion among the military elite deepened. The Führer's star was beginning to fall in the eyes of his own generals. The disillusionment was not confined to the Eastern Front. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps had initially achieved stunning victories, pushing British forces back across the desert. Yet by late 1942, the tide had turned decisively against Germany, particularly after the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. Rommel's forces, outnumbered and undersupplied, were eventually driven into retreat, culminating in their surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. For officers observing these campaigns, it became clear that Hitler's obsession with holding ground at all costs was strategically catastrophic. His refusal to authorize timely withdrawals turned military setbacks into catastrophic defeats. Generals who had devoted their lives to military science now saw their expertise overridden by ideology and arrogance. The contrast between professional judgment and Hitler's command widened into a chasm of mistrust. The defeat in North Africa, combined with the disaster at Stalingrad, signaled that Germany was losing the global war. Confidence in victory waned, replaced by bitter doubt. Among many officers, faith in Hitler as supreme commander was irreparably broken. This crisis of confidence revealed itself most sharply among senior staff officers, men trained to analyze the cold mathematics of war. Henning von Treschow, serving on the Eastern Front, witnessed firsthand the senseless loss of life caused by Hitler's orders. He became convinced that Germany faced inevitable defeat unless Hitler was removed. Treschow's doubts were not isolated. They resonated with figures like General Ludwig Beck, who had resigned years earlier in protest against Hitler's aggressive policies. The officers' mess halls, once filled with praise for Hitler's daring, now buzzed with quiet discontent. Some voiced frustration at his meddling in operational decisions, others whispered about his mental stability. What bound them together was the realization that Hitler's leadership endangered both the army and the nation. Military pride was deeply wounded, for defeats like Stalingrad were not only strategic failures, but humiliations in the eyes of history. Generals who had once sworn loyalty began to ask dangerous questions. Could Germany survive with Hitler at the helm? Could they afford not to act? The erosion of confidence in Hitler was accelerated by his increasing isolation from reality. At his headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, he surrounded himself with sycophants who reinforced his illusions of control. Reports from the front were often doctored to soften the scale of disaster. But the generals in the field knew the truth. They saw dwindling supplies, exhausted troops, and collapsing morale, realities that Hitler refused to acknowledge. His obsession with absolute authority meant that generals who contradicted him risked dismissal or worse. Yet even those who outwardly obeyed carried growing resentment in their hearts. Field officers felt trapped between their oath of loyalty to Hitler and their responsibility to their men. The oath, sworn personally to the Führer, weighed heavily on consciences but could not extinguish doubt. In this atmosphere, Resistance was not yet a plan, but a simmering discontent. The generals were beginning to view obedience not as duty, but as complicity in disaster. Their loyalty was cracking under the strain of reality. Stalingrad had also exposed the moral bankruptcy of Hitler's leadership. Survivors of the Eastern Front carried back not only stories of military disaster, but of atrocities committed under Hitler's orders. The Commissar Order, mandating the execution of Soviet political officers, and the mass killings of Jews and civilians undermined the Wehrmacht's honor. Many generals had tolerated or even enabled these crimes in earlier years, but as defeat loomed, some began to reckon with the stain upon their profession. Officers like Tresckow saw that Germany was not merely losing a war, but destroying its soul. This recognition added a moral dimension to their disillusionment, transforming doubt into resolve. Resistance was no longer only about saving Germany from military ruin, but also from moral annihilation. To stand idle was to be complicit in genocide and betrayal. For a proud military caste, this was unbearable. Their duty as officers, they felt, demanded more than silence. It demanded action. As disillusionment deepened, conversations once unthinkable began to surface within the officer corps. Small circles of trusted men shared their frustrations over late-night drinks, carefully guarded against informants. Ideas of removing Hitler, once whispered in outrage, became serious topics of discussion. Could a coup restore Germany's dignity? Could the army seize control and negotiate peace with the Allies? Men like Ludwig Beck and Karl Goerdeler envisioned a post-Hitler Germany, governed by law rather than ideology. Others, less idealistic, simply wanted to end the bloodshed and salvage what remained of the army. The war had created an environment where doubt turned into conspiracy. Each defeat pushed more officers toward the conclusion that Hitler himself was the problem. These conversations were fragile, always shadowed by fear of the Gestapo. Yet from them, networks began to form. The generals' doubts were crystallizing into the seeds of rebellion. For many, the breaking point came not from one defeat, but from the cumulative weight of disaster after disaster. The loss of North Africa was followed by Allied landings in Sicily and Italy, threatening Germany's southern flank. The Red Army, revitalized after Stalingrad, launched massive offensives that pushed German forces steadily westward. Air raids devastated German cities, shattering the illusion of home front security. Each setback underscored the futility of Hitler's strategy of clinging to territory at all costs. The generals realized they were fighting not for victory, but for Hitler's ego. Their doubts were no longer theoretical. They were carved into the corpses of millions. Resistance was not merely justified, but necessary. For officers bound by honor, this necessity clashed painfully with their oath of loyalty. Yet increasingly, they felt that loyalty to Germany outweighed loyalty to Hitler. The war had created conditions where treason became patriotism. By 1943, disillusionment among the generals was no longer a whisper but a quiet roar, echoing in underground networks of resistance. Men like Tresckow on the Eastern Front, Beck in retirement, Canaris in intelligence, and Goerdeler in politics began forging connections. Together, they envisioned not just removing Hitler, but reshaping Germany's future. The defeats of Stalingrad and North Africa had given them both the urgency and the justification to act. Their doubts had matured into determination, their conversations into planning. Resistance was still perilous, fraught with betrayal and danger, but the momentum was building. The generals were no longer content to endure disaster passively. They began to believe that history demanded their intervention. Out of the ashes of defeat arose the will to conspire. The doubts of 1943 were the foundation of Operation Valkyrie. The year 1943 marked a decisive shift from doubt to action within the German resistance, as officers who had witnessed Hitler's catastrophic decisions began to consider assassination as the only viable solution. Henning von Tresckow, serving as Chief Operations Officer on the Eastern Front, became one of the earliest and most determined conspirators. He was not a man of idle talk. Tresckow believed that moral outrage without action was itself a form of complicity. Surrounded by the ruins of Stalingrad and the brutal campaigns of the Eastern Front, he concluded that Germany's survival depended on removing Hitler by force. Tresckow built a network of like-minded officers, carefully selecting those whose loyalty to conscience outweighed blind obedience. Their conversations moved beyond complaints about strategy to detailed discussions of coup logistics and assassination opportunities. For Tresckow, this was not betrayal but duty. He argued that obedience to Hitler had become treason against Germany. His vision was both practical and moral, rooted in military necessity and human conscience. The birth of conspiracy began not in Berlin, but in the battle-scarred fields of Russia. It was there that resolve hardened into the first attempts. Tresckow's group quickly recognized that the Wehrmacht's prestige and organizational strength offered the best chance of success. Unlike scattered civilian dissidents or church leaders, the military had the discipline, weapons, and access to Hitler himself. Tresckow recruited officers like Fabian von Schlabrendorff, a young lawyer and staff officer who became his trusted accomplice. Together they devised plans to eliminate Hitler during his frequent visits to the Eastern Front headquarters. In March 1943, one of the earliest serious attempts took place. Tresckow arranged for a bomb disguised as a package of Cointreau liquor bottles to be placed aboard Hitler's aircraft. The device, prepared with meticulous care, was smuggled into the plane by Schlabrendorff, who disguised it as a gift for Colonel Helmuth Steiff. Yet fate intervened. The detonator failed in the freezing temperatures of the high-altitude flight, and Hitler landed safely, unaware of how close death had come. The conspirators retrieved the unexploded device in desperation, erasing the evidence of their attempt. For Tresckow, it was a bitter disappointment, but also confirmation that Hitler was not invincible. Each failure only deepened their determination. Another bold attempt followed only days later, showing the persistence of Tresckow's network. During a scheduled visit by Hitler to the headquarters of Army Group Center, the conspirators prepared for a direct assassination using a suicide bomber. Colonel Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, an officer with access to Hitler, volunteered to sacrifice his life by carrying explosives on his body. The plan hinged on Hitler spending time inspecting captured Soviet weapons in a museum display. Gersdorf concealed the bombs within his coat, set with a 10-minute fuse, intending to embrace death alongside the Führer. But Hitler, paranoid and impatient, rushed through the exhibition in less than 2 minutes, leaving Gersdorf with no opportunity to act. Risking discovery, he frantically defused the explosives in a bathroom stall, narrowly escaping exposure. Once again, the chance had slipped away, not because of lack of courage or planning, but because of Hitler's erratic behavior. For the conspirators, the near misses were haunting. They proved how fragile each opportunity was, balanced on timing, luck, and Hitler's whims. Yet failure did not extinguish the conspiracy. Instead, it broadened and matured. As the conspirators regrouped, they began to think beyond single acts of assassination toward the broader political framework required for a successful coup. Killing Hitler alone would not suffice if the Nazi Party or the SS retained control of Germany's machinery of power. Thus, leaders like Ludwig Beck and Karl Goerdeler were drawn into the planning, bringing political vision to complement military execution. Beck, the former chief of the General Staff, was regarded as a potential head of state after Hitler's death, embodying continuity and authority. Goedeler, the conservative former mayor of Leipzig, outlined plans for a post-Hitler government that restored the rule of law and reconnected Germany with the international community. These civilian leaders provided the conspirators with legitimacy, ensuring that the plot was not simply a military coup, but a vision for a new Germany. Secret meetings in Berlin apartments and country estates discussed everything from constitutional reform to foreign policy. It was a dangerous dance of ideas, with each man risking exposure every time he entered a conspiratorial room. From these meetings, Operation Valkyrie began to take conceptual shape. The conspiracy was evolving from spontaneous attempts to a coordinated movement. The conspirators also recognized the importance of securing military units in Berlin for any successful coup. Here General Friedrich Olbricht, stationed at the Army's General Office, became indispensable. He saw that an existing contingency plan called Operation Valkyrie, originally designed to mobilize the replacement army in case of civil unrest, could be repurposed for a coup. If Hitler were assassinated, the conspirators could activate Valkyrie under the pretense of defending the Reich, deploying troops in Berlin and across Germany to seize power from the SS and the Nazi Party. Olbricht, with his access to the bureaucratic machinery of the replacement army, quietly adapted the Valkyrie orders to serve this secret purpose. This was the crucial breakthrough, a legal, ready-made cover for a coup hidden within the Nazi state's own emergency plans. It meant that the plot had moved from improvised bombs to systemic preparation. The military infrastructure for rebellion now existed within Hitler's own system of control. Valkyrie was not just a plan but a weapon waiting for its moment. The challenge was finding the courage and opportunity to strike. The network of conspirators expanded further, connecting soldiers, politicians, and even clergy. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, already a thorn in the regime's side, became linked with the conspirators through his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi. Bonhoeffer offered moral legitimacy to the plot, arguing that resisting Hitler was not only justified, but demanded by conscience. Dohnanyi, working within the Abwehr under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, helped funnel information and coordinate contacts with foreign powers. The Abwehr itself became a hub of quiet opposition, shielding conspirators under the cloak of intelligence work. Canaris himself, though cautious, facilitated sabotage of Nazi policies and protected Jews and dissidents where possible. This web of connections gave the conspiracy greater resilience, but it also heightened the risk of betrayal. The Gestapo was ever watchful, and informants lurked in every corner of Germany. Yet in the secrecy of these networks, courage flourished. The birth of the conspiracy was no longer confined to isolated individuals. It had become a growing movement, fragile but determined. Despite their courage, the conspirators faced enormous challenges, not least of which was Hitler's peculiar luck in surviving repeated assassination attempts. Time and again, technical failures, timing mishaps, and sheer chance saved his life. To many Germans, these narrow escapes reinforced the myth of Hitler's destiny, as though Providence shielded him from harm. To the conspirators, it was a maddening pattern that tested their faith and endurance. Each failure risked exposure, as every unexploded bomb or cancelled plan left a trail of whispers and suspicions. The fear of discovery gnawed at them, yet so did the fear of inaction. For men like Tresckow and Beck, failure was preferable to doing nothing, for at least action meant honor. They reasoned that history would judge them not by success alone, but by their willingness to resist. In this conviction lay the resilience of the conspiracy. Even failure could inspire future action. What mattered most was to try. By the end of 1943, the conspiracy had matured from desperate attempts into a carefully organized movement poised for decisive action. The failures of early assassination efforts had taught hard lessons about timing, secrecy, and coordination. With Valkyrie adapted as a cover plan, and with political and military leaders committed, the conspirators stood closer than ever to a coherent strategy. Yet the risks were greater than ever, for the Gestapo's vigilance grew as Germany's fortunes declined. The conspirators walked a razor's edge, balancing hope and terror with every step. The birth of the conspiracy was both fragile and monumental. Fragile because discovery meant death, monumental because it represented Germany's last great chance to rid itself of tyranny. Each man involved knew that his life was forfeit if the plot failed, but the weight of history pressed heavily, convincing them that they had no choice. The conspiracy was alive, waiting only for the right moment to strike. Operation Valkyrie was no longer a dream. It was a living plan, ready to be unleashed. Claus von Stauffenberg was born in 1907 into an aristocratic Catholic family in Swabia, part of Germany's old nobility. He grew up surrounded by tradition, honor, and a strong sense of duty, values instilled by his upbringing and schooling. As a young man, Stauffenberg embraced both intellectual pursuits and military service, studying literature and philosophy while preparing for a career in the army. He was drawn to the romantic vision of the German officer as a guardian of the nation, combining chivalry with discipline. His early military career reflected ambition and competence, and he quickly distinguished himself among his peers. Like many of his class, he initially felt a certain sympathy for Hitler's restoration of national pride in the 1930s. Yet, unlike others, he harbored a keen critical mind that saw danger in blind devotion to ideology. Stauffenberg believed in Germany, but not in Nazism. This distinction would later define his path. He was a man shaped by tradition, yet willing to challenge it when conscience demanded. The outbreak of World War II placed Stauffenberg firmly within the machinery of the Wehrmacht, where his skills earned him rapid promotion. He served with distinction in the campaigns in Poland and France, admired for his courage and organizational brilliance. By 1941, he was a respected staff officer, chosen to work in planning roles for the General Staff. Yet as the war expanded into the Soviet Union, he became increasingly aware of the criminal nature of Hitler's policies. Reports of massacres of Jews, executions of civilians, and the scorched earth brutality of the Eastern Front reached him through military channels. Stauffenberg's Catholic upbringing and moral convictions made these atrocities intolerable. He began to view the war not as a defense of Germany, but as a campaign of annihilation driven by Hitler's madness. His faith in the Führer evaporated, replaced by a growing conviction that Hitler himself was Germany's greatest danger. This was not yet open resistance, but the seed of a personal transformation. For Stauffenberg, patriotism now meant opposing the dictator who claimed to embody Germany. In 1943, fate struck Stauffenberg in a brutal and life-altering way. While serving in Tunisia with the Afrika Korps, he was severely wounded during an Allied air attack in April. Shrapnel tore through his body, leaving him gravely injured and near death. He lost his right hand, 2 fingers from his left hand, and his left eye, along with enduring severe wounds to his body. For many, such injuries would have ended not only a military career, but also the will to act. Yet for Stauffenberg, recovery became a crucible of transformation. The suffering deepened his resolve and gave him clarity of purpose. He returned from months of medical treatment and rehabilitation, a changed man, scarred but unbroken. His physical wounds became symbols of his moral determination. He would not stand idle while Hitler destroyed Germany. In the tragedy of his mutilation, Stauffenberg found the steel to become the central figure of resistance. The sight of this wounded colonel, wearing an eye patch and carrying only partial use of one hand, inspired many who met him. He projected not weakness but strength, embodying sacrifice and resilience. Stauffenberg's aristocratic bearing and fierce intelligence gave him authority even in the shadow of more senior officers. In the circles of resistance, he became both respected and admired, a man who had paid the price of war and returned determined to change its course. His physical limitations made him an unlikely assassin, yet also a uniquely compelling one. To those around him, his injuries symbolized the wounds of Germany itself, scarred, weakened but not defeated. His courage was contagious, encouraging others who might otherwise have wavered. Stauffenberg brought to the conspiracy not only organizational skill, but a sense of destiny. In him the resistance found a face, a leader whose personal story embodied sacrifice and determination. His entrance into the conspiracy gave it new momentum and moral clarity. Stauffenberg's role in the conspiracy deepened as he assumed duties at the Army High Command in Berlin. This new position gave him direct access to both the Valkyrie contingency plans and to Hitler himself. Unlike earlier conspirators who struggled to get physically close to the Führer, Stauffenberg's role required regular attendance at high-level conferences. His combination of authority, courage, and proximity made him uniquely suited to carry out an assassination attempt. While men like Tresco had the vision, it was Stauffenberg who possessed the access and the willingness to risk everything. He argued that it was not enough to talk or to plan, someone had to act decisively, even at the cost of their own life. His determination cut through the hesitation and fear that had paralyzed earlier efforts. Stauffenberg was not reckless, but he was willing to embrace the inevitability of sacrifice. His leadership brought a new urgency to the Valkyrie plot. Where others doubted, he believed action must come soon, before Germany was utterly destroyed. As he entered the inner circle of conspirators, Stauffenberg also reshaped their sense of mission. For some, resistance had been primarily about military honor or political strategy. For Stauffenberg, it was also about conscience and the moral survival of the German people. He believed that history would not forgive Germany if no attempt was made to stop Hitler's crimes. In his view, even a failed assassination would prove that not all Germans had been complicit in tyranny. This conviction gave him a sense of urgency that sometimes unsettled his fellow conspirators who feared the risks of premature action. Stauffenberg argued passionately that waiting only increased Hitler's power and prolonged the war's suffering. His eloquence and intensity persuaded many who wavered. He transformed resistance from abstract discussions into a moral imperative. With his presence, the conspiracy ceased to be merely a desperate gamble. It became, in his eyes, a duty to God, Germany, and humanity. Yet, Stauffenberg's entry into the conspiracy was not without challenges. His injuries made the practicalities of assassination more difficult, as he could not easily handle or prepare explosives alone. He required assistance, relying on fellow officers like Werner von Hafen, his loyal adjutant, to help arm the bombs. This reliance did not weaken his resolve, but underscored the collective nature of the plot. He insisted on taking personal responsibility, arguing that leadership required bearing the greatest risk. His presence also introduced debates within the group. Should a man so visibly wounded take on the task of killing Hitler? Some feared failure if his physical limitations interfered, but Stauffenberg silenced such doubts with his determination. He refused to delegate the central act, convinced that destiny demanded his hand on the bomb. His courage silenced hesitation, binding others to the cause by the sheer force of his example. In Stauffenberg, resolve overcame limitation, his willpower transformed weakness into strength. By early 1944, Claus von Stauffenberg had become the indispensable leader of the Valkyrie conspiracy. His blend of aristocratic pride, military discipline, and moral conviction gave the movement a clarity it had previously lacked. While Tresco provided vision and Ulbricht provided organizational structure, it was Stauffenberg who carried the spirit of action. His personal story, the noble officer, gravely wounded yet unbowed, gave the resistance a human face that inspired both comrades and later generations. He was not driven by personal ambition, but by a profound sense of duty to Germany's future. His determination to act, even in the face of near-certain death, crystallized the conspiracy into a mission. Operation Valkyrie would forever be linked to his name, not because he was its sole architect, but because he embodied its spirit. In the wounded colonel, the conspiracy found its sword and shield. Stauffenberg's entry marked the moment when words became action. The plot to kill Hitler had found its champion. The conspiracy to overthrow Adolf Hitler was never the work of one man alone. It was the convergence of multiple networks, each bound by a shared conviction that Germany had to be saved from destruction. At the center of these circles stood Ludwig Beck, Karl Goerdeler, and Henning von Tresco, three men from vastly different backgrounds, united by conscience and urgency. Beck, the former chief of the General Staff, embodied military authority and intellectual gravitas, respected even by those who disagreed with him. Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, was a civilian conservative with a passion for law, order, and international respectability. Tresco, the soldier on the Eastern Front, was a man of action whose moral outrage propelled him toward assassination plots. Each brought different strengths: Beck the legitimacy of leadership, Goerdeler the vision of governance, and Tresco the daring to strike. Together they formed the backbone of a conspiracy that aimed to blend strategy, politics, and morality. Their alliance illustrated the diversity of German resistance, stretching across military, political, and civilian spheres. It was a fragile network, yet one capable of shaking the Nazi state. Ludwig Beck's path into resistance began long before Valkyrie took shape. As chief of the General Staff in the 1930s, he had argued against Hitler's reckless plans for war, resigning in protest in 1938, when his warnings went unheeded. Unlike many contemporaries, Beck understood that Germany lacked the resources for global conflict, and that Hitler's policies would end in disaster. After leaving his post, he became a quiet but central figure in anti-Nazi circles, admired for his integrity and foresight. In the conspirators' eyes, Beck represented not only wisdom but also a potential head of state for a post-Hitler Germany. His name carried credibility, both at home and abroad, a vital asset if the Allies were to consider negotiations after a coup. Though no longer in uniform, Beck remained a general in spirit, ready to serve when Germany most needed him. His home in Berlin became a hub for clandestine meetings, where officers and civilians alike came to seek his guidance. Beck's calm demeanor masked a burning conviction that Hitler had to be removed. He became the intellectual anchor of the conspiracy, the elder statesman of resistance. Karl Goerdeler provided the political and civilian dimension that the military could not. A conservative administrator, he had served as mayor of Leipzig and was deeply rooted in Germany's civic traditions. Goerdeler was appalled by the Nazis' assault on law, morality, and economic stability, particularly their persecution of Jews and destruction of municipal autonomy. Forced from office for his refusal to conform, he became a vocal critic of the regime, though always under the cloak of careful discretion. In resistance circles, Goerdeler emerged as the natural choice for chancellor in a post-Hitler government. He drafted detailed plans for reorganizing Germany's administration, rebuilding its international relations, and restoring the rule of law. His vision included reconciliation with the West, an end to racial policies, and a return to constitutional governance. While some criticized him for his conservative rigidity, others respected his thoroughness and moral clarity. He was, above all, a man of principle who risked everything to imagine a better Germany. Goodella gave the conspiracy its civilian legitimacy, ensuring it was not merely a military putsch but a political rebirth. Henning von Tresckow, meanwhile, gave the conspiracy its heartbeat of action. Serving as a senior officer on the Eastern Front, Tresckow was haunted by the atrocities committed by German forces under Hitler's command. He had seen villages burned, civilians executed, and Jews massacred, crimes that corroded the Wehrmacht honor and Germany's humanity. For Tresckow, resistance was not merely about strategy, but about morality. Germany's soul was at stake. He became one of the first officers to declare openly that Hitler must die, reasoning that every day of delay cost thousands of innocent lives. Tresckow orchestrated several assassination attempts, including the famous bomb plot on Hitler's plane in March 1943, which failed only due to technical malfunction. Despite these setbacks, his determination never wavered. He built a web of trusted officers around him, cultivating loyalty through his integrity and courage. For many conspirators, Tresckow represented the conscience of the army. His relentless drive for action kept the conspiracy alive, even when others hesitated. In Tresckow, moral outrage became operational resolve. The networks Beck, Goodella, and Tresckow led were not isolated silos, but interwoven threads of resistance. Meetings often brought together men of different professions and ideologies, aristocrats, socialists, clergy, and bureaucrats. They were bound less by shared ideology than by a common conclusion. Hitler was leading Germany to ruin. This diversity made the network both strong and fragile. Strong because it united disparate elements of German society in a shared cause. Fragile because divisions in ideology sometimes created mistrust. Goodella, for instance, often clashed with more radical conspirators over the future structure of Germany, insisting on conservative order rather than sweeping reform. Beck, cautious and deliberate, sometimes frustrated Tresckow, who demanded immediate action. Yet despite tensions, their alliance endured because the urgency of stopping Hitler outweighed disagreements. The network was not a unified movement, but a coalition of conscience. It was held together by the gravity of history and the recognition that time was running out. These networks operated under constant threat from the Gestapo, whose surveillance reached into every corner of German life. Meetings were disguised as social gatherings, correspondence cloaked in code, and plans hidden in bureaucratic paperwork. Trusted intermediaries carried messages between Berlin and the Eastern Front, often risking exposure at checkpoints. The Abwehr, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, provided some cover, as elements within the intelligence service shielded conspirators under the guise of official duties. Yet even with these precautions, the danger was immense. A single betrayal or careless word could unravel years of preparation. Many conspirators lived with the daily expectation of arrest, their loyalty to one another tested by fear. What sustained them was the conviction that silence would make them complicit in Hitler's crimes. In the shadows of dictatorship, secrecy became both armor and prison. The networks of resistance were fragile, but their existence was itself a defiance of tyranny. What distinguished these figures was not merely their opposition, but their willingness to envision a post-Hitler Germany. Beck drafted constitutional frameworks, Goodella outlined governmental structures, and Tresckow considered military strategies to stabilize the country. Their plans included immediate negotiations with the Western Allies, hoping to prevent Germany's complete destruction. They also imagined the restoration of civil liberties, the rebuilding of judicial independence, and the integration of Germany into a peaceful Europe. This forward-looking vision gave the conspiracy more depth than a mere assassination plot. It was a blueprint for redemption, however fragile and contested. While disagreements abounded, especially over how much of Germany's past to preserve, the conspirators agreed that action was imperative. Their vision was both practical and moral, rooted in a desire to salvage what remained of Germany's honor. The networks of resistance were thus both a sword against tyranny and a scaffold for renewal. Turning moral outrage into action required more than courage. It demanded bureaucratic cunning, logistical precision, and an ability to hide a weapon inside the enemy's machinery. The conspirators discovered that the German state, with all its paperwork, orders, and contingency plans, could be turned against itself if they could manipulate the levers already in place. Operation Valkyrie, originally an emergency reserve plan drawn up by the Army High Command to maintain order in the event of internal unrest, presented exactly such a lever, a legally authorized mechanism to mobilize the replacement army Ersatzheer and assume control of key communications and infrastructure. General Friedrich Olbricht and his office inside the army, General Army Office, the Ersatzheer, quietly set to work rewriting and adapting the Valkyrie orders so that under the pretext of suppressing an uprising, loyal troops could be dispatched to seize control of Berlin, disarm SS units, and arrest top Nazi leaders. This was not improvisation, but careful grafting, forged signatures, amended contingency instructions, and detailed lists of units to be mobilized were prepared well before any assassination attempt. The conspirators invested enormous energy into making the paperwork look authentic. The language, stamps, and clerical habits had to match the Reichswehr's exacting standards. In the cold calculus of coup-making, a believable order was a loaded gun. If the orders read and looked correct, units would move obediently. If they hesitated, the entire plan could collapse. Thus the machinery of state became the conspirators' battlefield. Olbricht's office became the inner workshop of the plot, a place where blank forms, official seals, and stolen stationery transformed into instruments of revolution. Werner von Hayeften, Olbricht's adjutant, and other trusted staff worked tirelessly, inserting coded clauses that would activate only when the conspirators triggered Valkyrie. They mapped out command chains, designated arrest teams, and prepared lists of key offices to be seized: the propaganda ministry, the Gestapo headquarters, radio stations, and the offices of the Reichsbank. Radio would be central. Controlling broadcasts meant controlling the narrative and sowing confusion among Nazi loyalists. The conspirators rehearsed how to place military governors in Berlin, how to cut telephone lines, and how to requisition armored vehicles under legitimate-sounding orders. Every step was documented, anticipating possible challenges and contingencies. They even prepared forged telegrams and backdated orders to smooth any awkward transitions. The bureaucracy itself, once weaponized, promised speed. Troops would obey the written word, even if they did not yet know the meaning behind it. In the final calculus, the success of the coup depended less on battles and more on the credibility of a signature. Communications networks were a second pillar of the coup machinery, and here the conspirators exploited both modern technology and human vulnerabilities. The plan relied on instantaneous messages, telephone, teleprinter, and radio to mobilize units across the Reich simultaneously, preventing the SS from consolidating a defensive response. Central to this strategy was the use of the Ersatzheer's established signal corps, which could transmit Valkyrie orders directly into divisional headquarters and through the Wehrmacht's respected channels. Experienced clerks and signal officers, themselves part of Ulbricht's network or sympathetic to the cause, were prepared to reroute messages, manipulate call logs, and ensure that the orders appeared to come from legitimate sources. Yet the conspirators understood that the Gestapo and SD monitored communications. Deception had to be surgical and swift. They planned block-by-block actions, seize the main telegraph and phone exchanges, occupy radio studios, and flood airwaves with official announcements to preempt any counter-messaging from Goebbels or Himmler. Code phrases and pre-arranged signals were chosen to minimize ambiguity and give commanding officers the confidence to act instantly. In an era before digital encryption, the conspirators relied on institutional trust, the same trust Hitler had cultivated to centralize command and prepared to exploit it ruthlessly. Another critical element was personnel, who could be trusted to carry out orders without wavering. The conspirators carefully identified officers in key posts who either shared their views or could be persuaded by duty and the appearance of lawful command. Many mid-level and senior officers were ambivalent toward Nazism and deeply loyal to the army's traditions, making them susceptible to orders that came stamped with Reichswehr authority. The plan also relied on certain Wehrmacht institutions, military police, replacement army units, and guard battalions, whose commanders could be quickly persuaded to act under written directives. To minimize surprises, the conspirators prepared dossiers and talking points for sympathetic commanders, emphasizing restoration of constitutional order, prevention of civil war, and protection of Germany from ruin. Arguments tailored to the conservative mindsets that predominated among many officers. Recruitment was cautious. New members were only introduced through trusted intermediaries, and often after careful vetting. The conspirators knew that a single betrayal within the ranks could lead to immediate arrests, which is why they compartmentalized information. Some officers needed only the letter of the order, not the ideology behind it. This cellular approach reduced risk, but made coordination harder, a trade-off the planners accepted. Above all, they counted on institutional discipline. A signed order from the Ersatzheer they believed would carry the day. The conspirators also understood that public perception mattered. They could seize control of ministries and arrest leaders, but unless the populace, and crucially, the German civil service and foreign governments, accepted a new authority, chaos could follow. Karl Gödel and other civilian figures worked on communication strategy, who would be named Provisional Chancellor, which ministers would be retained, and how to reassure foreign powers that the coup aimed at ending the war and restoring legitimacy. They prepared proclamations and policy outlines promising immediate ceasefire talks and restoration of legal order. These documents were drafted with an eye to diplomacy. A credible, sober civilian front would make the coup look less like a military putsch and more like a legitimate transfer of power. The conspirators planned to broadcast appeals, urging calm, emphasizing that normal life would continue and that the true enemies were the SS and fanatic Nazis who had betrayed Germany. Propaganda, previously the regime's tool, would be repurposed to argue for stability and peace. In the back of every planner's mind was the hope that Allied commanders, seeing a functioning German government eager to sue for peace, might negotiate terms that spared further destruction. The coup was therefore as much a political performance as a military seizure. Logistics, the mundane, practical arrangements that make any operation work, consumed meticulous attention. Lists were drawn up of vehicles, fuel depots, armories, and detention facilities. Maps marked choke points and routes into Berlin. Supply lines were re-examined to ensure the replacement army units could be fed and moved quickly. The conspirators also prepared safe houses for the key leaders, with contingencies if arrest seemed imminent. Werner von Haffen and others rehearsed the physical act of carrying the bomb and getting out of the wolf's lair. Others practiced how to storm radio stations or cordon off the Reich Chancellery. The plan involved synchronized timing down to the hour, explode the bomb, then within minutes broadcast the Valkyrie orders nationwide. They planned for detentions of SS officers and for seizing the Gestapo archives, essential for proving criminality and limiting reprisals. The conspirators even prepared rudimentary legal documents to legitimize their actions, decrees dissolving certain Nazi offices, orders appointing military governors, and lists of individuals to be detained. They were pragmatic about violence, minimize it where possible, but be prepared to use force decisively if resistance arose. The coup machinery was therefore as much about paper and personnel as about operational speed and ruthless contingency planning. Secrecy remained paramount, and the conspirators developed systems to reduce the chance of leakage. Meetings took place in private homes, in secluded rooms of military offices, and in the quiet hours of the night. Communications used trusted couriers, sealed envelopes, and back channels through the Abwehr. Sensitive documents were burned immediately after reading. They understood human nature, fear, greed, family pressures, and therefore limited the information given to each recruit. That way, even if an individual were captured and tortured, he could betray only fragments of the plan, not the whole network. The conspirators cultivated plausible deniability. They made sure that many orders could reasonably be framed as routine administrative measures if discovered prematurely. They also capitalized on the Wehrmacht's culture of obedience. Men who claimed to be acting under direct orders from high command were more likely to be obeyed and less likely to be suspected. However, the network's very success bred paranoia. Trust had to be continually reassessed, and small missteps were punished by replacing entire cells. The balance between operational transparency and the need for secrecy was the constant tension of the conspirators' lives. By mid-1944, the coup machinery was as ready as it could be, without the decisive act that would trigger it. Forged orders lay prepared. Radio studios had been scouted. Sympathetic commanders had been quietly briefed. Arrest lists waited in sealed envelopes, and provisions for a provisional government had been drafted. All that remained was the single suicidal gamble to place an explosive device where it might kill Adolf Hitler, and in the ensuing confusion to activate Valkyrie so that the replacement army would lock down the capital and disarm the SS. The conspirators had built a cold, bureaucratic apparatus capable of moving millions by the power of a pen and a stamp. They had turned Germany's own administrative heartbeat into a coup instrument. It was a dangerous irony, the legalist nature of Valkyrie, designed to preserve order, repurposed to overthrow an entire system. The machinery was not perfect. It relied on human obedience, speed, and 1,000 small acts of faith. But in a totalitarian state where law had been bent into terror, legality was their best camouflage. The stage was set, the paper trail had been prepared, and when the day came, the conspirators would test whether the state's loyalty lay with its institutions or with the man who had corrupted them. From the moment the conspiracy moved beyond private conversation into concrete plotting, the conspirators lived under the twin spectres of exposure and miscalculation. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, had long since turned suspicion into a state industry. Networks of informants, casual denunciations, and routine surveillance made secrecy a fragile commodity. Every clandestine meeting might be observed by a neighbor who owed loyalty to the regime. Every courier might be stopped and searched, and every scrap of forged paper could betray a cell if discovered in the wrong hands. The conspirators knew that the Gestapo did not need perfect proof to act. Rumor, innuendo, or a single piece of circumstantial evidence could trigger arrest, torture, and a show trial. That knowledge shaped everything they did, whom they trusted, how they met, even what phrases they used. Paranoia was not an indulgence but a survival skill. In the months and years before July 20th, the danger of infiltration was everywhere, a cold, constant pressure that forced conspirators to hide plans in bureaucratic normality and to trust only those who had already risked everything. The tension between the need to recruit and the need for secrecy became the conspiracy's defining dilemma. The internal politics of Germany's security services made the danger more acute. The Abwehr, military intelligence under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, harbored a strain of skepticism toward Nazi ideology and thus became a covert sanctuary for some conspirators. Yet it was also an institution whose loyalties were contested and whose staff included true believers and opportunists. The Gestapo and the Sicherheitsdienst (SD), overseen by Himmler and Heydrich, were relentless and ruthless, and they were constantly probing the Abwehr for signs of disloyalty. This institutional rivalry meant that even allies could be exposed if the wrong official drew attention to a pattern of irregularities. Conspirators like Hans von Donani and others who worked within the Abwehr tried to use its cloak to shield resistance, but that cloak had holes, intercepted cables, suspicious travel records, or careless talk at a Bruderkranz dinner could, and sometimes did, lead back to them. Thus the networks were always balancing on a knife edge, using official channels to look like routine business, while hiding the deadly purpose beneath. The state's own information apparatus was both the conspirators' tool and their deadliest threat. The technical and human failures of earlier attempts underscored how perilous any assassination was, and how easily chance could sabotage months of preparation. Henning von Tresco's March 1943 attempt to blow up Hitler's plane showed both ingenuity and fragility. A bomb disguised among bottles of Cointreau, expertly assembled and audaciously placed aboard the aircraft, failed because the cold of high-altitude flight rendered the detonator inoperative. The conspirators had calculated carefully. They could not have predicted the temperature's betrayal. A few months later, Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf volunteered for a suicide attack in a museum, only to be foiled by Hitler's unusually brisk inspection of the exhibition. In each case, the difference between success and failure was a few seconds or a single mechanical fault, accidents of timing and chemistry rather than failures of will. These near misses taught the network painful lessons about contingency. Redundancy was vital, but redundancy increased risk of exposure. Simpler plans reduced the chance of technical failure, but left more room for human hesitation. Each aborted attempt raised the stakes for the next, tightening the conspirators' nerves and narrowing the margin for error. Beyond bad luck, betrayal by individuals, deliberate or coerced, was an ever-present menace. The Gestapo employed ubiquitous methods of extracting confessions and information, surveillance, blackmail, and torture. A captured courier could reveal names under duress. A coerced clerk could point to altered orders. A frightened defendant could provide the Gestapo with the exact phrasing used in secret meetings. The threat of betrayal also extended to those who were not agents, but who, out of fear or self-preservation, reported suspicious behavior to authorities. The conspirators therefore vetted recruits again and again, sometimes rejecting men of competence simply because their personal circumstances, a vulnerable family member, a history of debts, suggested instability. Even the strongest oaths meant little. Once a Gestapo investigator sat across from a suspect with the power to destroy his life and those of his family. This calculus of risk meant that the network remained smaller than its ambitions required. It meant that some capable officers were never brought into the plot, simply because their vulnerability presented an unacceptable liability. Tension between openness and compartmentalization produced tragic ironies. The conspirators needed more hands to activate Valkyrie across the Reich. Yet the more people involved, the more opportunities for leakage. To minimize that risk, they compartmentalized knowledge. Some knew only orders, others only timing. Very few understood the full picture. That approach made the plan resilient to a single arrest, but brittle in execution, because coordinated action required rapid, reliable communication between semi-independent cells. The July 20th plot would later suffer precisely from that brittleness. Units in Berlin acted, other regions hesitated, and conflicting reports created paralysis. In earlier months, the same problem had led to half successes, arrests of small groups, the failure to mobilize key regiments, the discovery of forged orders before they could be fully promulgated. This balance between the need for operational security and the practicalities of wartime coordination remained an unresolved dilemma, one that would haunt the conspirators until the fateful day. Compromise and moral ambiguity added another layer of risk. The conspirators were not a monolith of saintly martyrs. They included men prepared to make hard, sometimes morally questionable choices to achieve their aims. Some argued for deception that would implicate or use criminal collaborators. Others contemplated the arrest of comrades to save the larger enterprise. The ethical tightrope was treacherous. The need to act decisively sometimes meant treating co-conspirators as expendable or embracing ruthless measures that made post-war claims to legitimacy more complicated. For example, plans to detain SS leaders and to use military tribunals raised questions about legality and revenge. These pragmatic, morally grey decisions were difficult to defend publicly and created internal dissent that adversaries could exploit. In a regime where the law itself had been mutilated, the conspirators wrestled with whether employing the instruments of that very state, courts, arrests, military units, would make them indistinguishable from their enemies. Such debates delayed action and created splintered loyalties, further increasing the risk of betrayal or fragmentation at critical moments. Surveillance technology and administrative traceability worked relentlessly against secrecy. The Nazi state kept massive records, travel manifests, staff rosters, teleprinter logs, vehicle requisition forms. The conspirators had to forge signatures and falsify entries that would withstand casual inspection by clerks trained to notice irregularities. A mismatched stamp or a backdated memo risked discovery. A requisition for vehicles that did not fit routine needs could attract attention. The Gestapo's administrative detectives were adept at following paper trails and had access to all the channels the conspirators sought to manipulate. In such an environment, seemingly trivial clerical errors became mortal dangers. The conspirators therefore invested enormous effort into making their paperwork perfect, often reheating the forgeries and checking stamps until frustration and fatigue set in. The bureaucratic fight was as exhausting as any battlefield engagement. They fought the regime with its own lingua franca, paper, and the margin of error remained hair-thin. Yet perhaps the most devastating risk was the moral cost of discovery. The Gestapo's reprisals did not stop at the conspirators and their immediate families. Once a network was exposed, roundups and investigations typically expanded outward in a widening gyre of terror. Arrests swept up friends, colleagues, and distant associates. Denunciations fed prosecutions. Entire departments were purged. The conspirators knew that capture likely meant not only their own deaths, but the unmaking of networks that had taken years to build and the persecution of those they loved. This knowledge added an almost unbearable moral weight to every decision, act, and cause potential mass suffering. weight and risk prolonging a murderous regime. It is this terrible calculus that explains the conspirators' mixture of urgency and hesitancy, a paradox of courage and restraint shaped by the very real expectation of brutal betrayal. In the end, risk and betrayal were not merely tactical problems to be solved. They were existential dilemmas that defined the character of the German resistance. The Wolf's Lair, or Wolfschanz, sat like a secret city carved into the forested hills near Rassenburg in East Prussia. Concealed by dense pines and camouflaged earthworks, it was built in 1941 as Adolf Hitler's forward headquarters for the Eastern Front. From the outside, it appeared as a cluster of bunkers and guard posts, but inside it functioned as a fortified microstate, complete with barracks, mess halls, conference rooms, and its own power and communications infrastructure. Security was absolute. Layers of checkpoints, minefields, and anti-aircraft emplacements ringed the compound, while SS guards and signals officers monitored every approach. Hitler visited frequently, using the secluded site to receive briefings, host strategic councils, and cultivate an atmosphere of invulnerability. For the conspirators, the Wolf's Lair represented both opportunity and obstacle. An opportunity because it concentrated the Führer among a predictable staff, and an obstacle because it was the most heavily guarded place in the Reich. The headquarters architecture reflected Adolf Hitler's paranoia and his need for ritualized command, with reinforced conference bunkers designed to withstand bombing and assassination attempts. Inside those concrete walls, strategies were debated and fatal orders were signed. Inside those walls, too, small human dramas unfolded, including the furtive plotting of men who would soon try to kill him. The Wolf's Lair was thus a paradox, a place of operational brilliance and bureaucratic habit, and simultaneously a machine of isolation that insulated Hitler from the very realities his generals tried to convey. In July 1944, it would become the stage where one of history's most audacious acts of regicide was attempted. Hitler's daily routines at the Wolf's Lair were highly ritualized, beginning with briefings that marshaled maps, intelligence estimates, and officers' reports. Meetings were formal affairs. Commanders presented situation maps, while adjutants took notes and photographers recorded the proceedings for the Führer's archives. Access to the Führer was tightly controlled. Visitors were vetted, passes checked, and civilian staff kept at arm's length. The famous order of seating in conference rooms mattered, as placement signaled rank and access to Hitler's ear. Even small details, like cigarette breaks, walking paths, and where Hitler preferred to stand during briefings, were known and observed by those who served him. This choreography produced both predictability and security, a pattern the conspirators studied obsessively in search of an opening. Yet the same routines bred complacency among some staff, who trusted the formalities more than they should have. The Wolf's Lair's combination of military efficiency and personal habit made it an ecosystem where moments of human error could have monumental consequences. For Stauffenberg and his colleagues, the ritualized life there offered narrow windows, a conference, a table, an unlatched door, where a well-placed explosive might transform habit into catastrophe. Understanding the daily ebb and flow of the Wolf's Lair became as important to the plot as forging orders or recruiting officers. The layout of the Wolf's Lair consisted of multiple camouflaged bunkers, each with thick reinforced concrete walls and blast doors. The Führer's conference bunker, designated as Hut 20, was a relatively low wood-paneled summerhouse-like structure used for meetings during the warm months. Beneath it lay heavier fortifications, but the conference room itself had windows and lighter roofing compared to the deeper command bunkers. It was this lighter construction and the habit of opening the windows for air that created the precise vulnerability the conspirators needed. Surrounding Hut 20 were walkways and small clearing spaces where staff officers paced and adjutants carried messages. A network of sentries and SS officers patrolled the perimeter, but the immediate internal security assumed that the Führer's presence deterred ordinary attacks. The location chosen for the bomb thus had to balance proximity to Hitler with a plausible reason for bringing an innocuous package into the room. Stauffenberg's ability to enter Hut 20 with a briefcase depended on that choreography of trust and routine. Maps and models of the site, smuggled among staff, allowed conspirators to rehearse the movement of men and the timing of the planned detonation. In the concrete geometry of Wolf's Lair, the conspirators saw both a fortress and a stage, where calculation might convert wood and air into an explosive verdict. Hitler's increasingly erratic behavior at the Wolf's Lair only amplified both the danger and the opportunity for conspirators. He often appeared in moods of unpredictable volatility, alternately rapturous when hearing good news and furious when reports did not match his expectations. In private, he favored walking out into the light or standing near a table rather than hiding behind the heavy doors of the deepest bunkers, habits he believed made him appear heroic and in command. His confidence encouraged staff to adopt informal manners around him, small relaxations that eroded absolute security in practice. At the same time, his paranoia prompted constant changes in guard rotation and identity checks, meaning that access procedures could shift with little notice. The conspirators had to track this capriciousness, for their plans depended on moments when protocol softened. Sometimes Hitler postponed meetings, shortened conferences, or changed seating, and conspirators had to improvise rapidly. His personal routine thus became a double-edged sword. It generated both protective rituals and unpredictable breaks in those rituals that could be exploited. Those who observed him closely could predict small habits, a favored chair, a cigarette between briefings, that would determine the timing of an assassination attempt. The Wolf's Lair was a living organism of routine and whim, where the smallest human decision could alter the course of history. Hitler's inner circle at the Wolf's Lair included a tight coterie of adjutants, valet staff, and SS guards who formed a protective ring around him. Men like Heinz Lingt, his valet, and Nikolaus von Below, one of his Luftwaffe adjutants, managed access and daily ritual, deciding who might stand close for conversation. The Führer's personal security also included a detachment of Waffen-SS and Reichssicherheitsdienstmen whose loyalty to Himmler and the Reich was presumed absolute. These men conducted searches, screened incoming packages in certain periods, and maintained a visible posture of deterrence that discouraged casual intrusion. At the same time, the sheer volume of daily visitors, staff officers, foreign envoys, staff photographers created practical limits on how thoroughly every item could be inspected. The conspirators exploited these bureaucratic gaps by timing deliveries and calibrating the appearance of packages to avoid prolonged scrutiny. Some SS officers, however, were suspicious by nature and would probe packages or question motives, making the task perilous. The relationship between Hitler's personal staff and the SS created both a protective buffer and bureaucratic blind spots that the plotters had to navigate. For Stauffenberg, getting through this gauntlet required both official papers and social confidence. He moved with the demeanor of a man whose wounds had earned him honor and whose rank granted him access. The complexity of personal security at Wolf's Lair thus proved both the conspiracy's greatest obstacle and, paradoxically, its most exploitable weakness. Reaching the Wolf's Lair was itself an exercise in military logistics, involving airfields, security corridors, and a protocol of arrival that reinforced the compound's secrecy. Visitors typically flew in on military transports to nearby airstrips, from which they were driven in convoys under escort through cordoned forest roads. These convoys were subject to identity checks at multiple points, and sometimes to searches of vehicles and luggage, protocols that the conspirators carefully studied. The Luftwaffe's role in ferrying staff officers and wounded veterans like Stauffenberg added another layer of complication and opportunity. Aircraft schedules could be used to time arrivals and departures in ways that minimized scrutiny. Inside the perimeter, movement was tightly choreographed, designated paths led to specific huts, and visitors were expected to remain within assigned zones. For an operation as delicate as an assassination, the conspirators had to coordinate not only the meeting, but also how to enter and leave without arousing suspicion. They rehearsed exits, contingency routes, and pretexts for leaving the compound immediately after a conference, key because a bomb's detonation would trigger a scramble. Medical transports and staff cars sometimes allowed for plausible departures, as did the culture of deference shown to decorated officers. This choreography of travel became part of the plan's architecture. Movement as mimicry, travel as camouflage. The Wolf's Lair, for all its fortifications, relied on flow of people, papers, and planes, and the conspirators learned to read and manipulate that flow. Communications in and out of the Wolf's Lair were handled by a sophisticated signals network, connecting the compound to the Wehrmacht High Command and to regional army groups. Teleprinters, encrypted radio messages, and cipher clerks maintained a steady stream of operational data, while photographers documented meetings for the Reich's propaganda archives. This constant flow meant that meetings at the Lair were simultaneously operationally vital and politically performative, two qualities that shaped what could be said and who could be trusted. Hitler's fear of leaks prompted occasional changes in cipher protocols and the presence of Sicherheitsdienst observers at sensitive briefings. The conspirators needed to know not only where Hitler would be, but what channels would be momentarily less monitored so that their actions could proceed with minimal interference. On top of coded communications, the presence of foreign military attaches and journalists on occasion added both distraction and risk, complicating the conspirators' calculus. Even private conversations in the gardens or along shaded paths risked exposure if a phone line or cipher clerk overheard a remark and misinterpreted its significance. The Lair's intelligence apparatus was therefore both a source of critical situational awareness and a web of surveillance that could entangle anyone who deviated from expected routine. For the plotters, timing was about more than the bomb's fuse. It was about finding a moment when the signal's net would not immediately trigger lethal countermeasures. In the interplay of coded messages and human watchers, the Wolf's Lair's intelligence systems became both guardian and predator. The Wolf's Lair was more than a military headquarters. It was a totem of Hitler's authority, a physical manifestation of the Führer's control over war and state. Its very name, evocative of predatory strength, bespoke a will to dominate and to command from a fortress carved into the earth. For those plotting against him, it represented the central node of the regime's power, the place where, if Hitler fell, the administrative heart might be vulnerable. For Hitler and his circle, the Lair projected incorruptibility, a perception that the Führer was insulated from the consequences his policies produced. The attempt on July 20th would be a collision between this symbolism and the brutal arithmetic of explosives. It would pit one man's secret against the facade of a fortified state. The choice of the Wolf's Lair as the site for assassination was thus both strategic and symbolic. To kill Hitler, where he most believed himself secure, would be the ultimate denial of his myth. In that forested complex of concrete and routine, men would test whether bureaucracy could protect tyranny or whether human agency could pierce its walls. The site's later crumbling after the war would mirror the collapse of the myths it had been built to protect. For historians and storytellers, the Wolf's Lair remains a chilling reminder that power often concentrates in places vulnerable to the smallest acts of courage. In July 1944, it was at the Wolf's Lair that fate would decide whether Germany's future lay in the hands of a dictator or in the desperate gamble of a few who dared to resist. July 20th, 1944 dawned like any other summer day over the East Prussian forest. But for the conspirators, it carried the weight of a year's worth of planning and the knowledge that everything might be decided within a single hour. Claus von Stauffenberg, still raw from his wounds, yet steady in purpose, rose early and ran through the script of what he must do, rehearsing the small rituals that would mask a monstrous act beneath the veneer of official business. Around Berlin and across the Ersatzheer headquarters, Friedrich Ulbricht and his confidants prepared the Valkyrie orders, ensuring that forged signatures and stamped forms were ready to flow the moment the signal was given. In the Wolf's Lair, staff officers checked maps, briefings were printed, and the ritual of military procedure began to conceal the extraordinary beneath the ordinary. The conspirators moved with the cold efficiency of men who had deliberately trained the state to obey paper and stamp, rather than conscience and loyalty. Everyone knew the plan's two central acts, kill Hitler, and immediately activate Valkyrie to seize control of the capital and neutralize the SS. Time, coordination, and an iron nerve were essential. There would be no room for hesitation. The mood was a brittle mix of resolve and fear, for the men involved understood the scale of what they attempted. Each man who walked toward his appointed post carried with him not only tools but the burden of history. The morning carried the hush of something momentous about to break. Stauffenberg flew into Rasenberg with a small entourage, his presence given the appearance of routine duties of a staff officer with a recent combat record, a cover that the conspirators had cultivated carefully. He had in his briefcase 2 explosive devices prepared in advance and a small deliberate deception. The bomb was disguised among papers and cigars to appear as a typical staff package. Werner von Hafferten, his loyal aide, accompanied him, ready to arm the device and to help carry out the plan. Security at the Wolf's Lair, though stringent in theory, operated on habit and deference to rank, and Stauffenberg's wound decorations and official papers smoothed his passage through checkpoints. In the corridors, the conspirators greeted one another with the casual professionalism of officers, accustomed to life under arms, yet beneath the formality lay a current of adrenaline. Stauffenberg checked the clock relentlessly, timing the sequence that would transform a meeting into momentary chaos. The plan depended on the bomb detonating, and the resulting confusion creating a legal pretext for Valkyrie's activation. He moved through the compound with a face of calm, a mask that concealed the urgency of a man carrying an instrument of death. Every handshake, every nod, felt like a small rehearsal for a final, irrevocable act. The compound's routines were the conspirators' camouflage, and they wore it like armor. Inside Hut 20, the conference room smelled of tobacco and paper, a room designed for talk, for maps, for the ritualized making of war. Hitler sat surrounded by his senior staff, and a circle of officers who trusted his presence more than they feared his policies. The meeting's agenda was the Eastern Front, with generals presenting reports that trivialized the human cost in favor of operational charts and supply lines. Hitler's voice moved from clipped orders to bursts of fury and odd reassurances, a tide that those who had watched him for years understood to be both theatrical and dangerous. Stauffenberg entered with deliberate step and formal salute, his limp hidden beneath the uniform, his eye patch a small mark that somehow legitimized both wartime sacrifice and access. He placed the briefcase under the heavy table near to where Hitler usually stood, choosing a spot that balanced proximity with a hope for lethality. He set the device's arming mechanism quickly and with practiced hands, aware that his impairment made the seconds count all the more. Adjutants moved about, maps were unfolded, and the ritual of briefing replaced the ordinary hush of mourning with urgency. The room felt suddenly smaller, as if the concrete walls themselves leaned closer to witness what was about to happen. Conversations continued around him, men oblivious to the fact that the physical geometry of the room and the voice at its center were about to change everything. For Stauffenberg, the moment was an intersection of faith, duty, and mortal resolve. At roughly 12:42 p.m., Stauffenberg excused himself under the pretext of a phone call and moved toward a safer distance to arm the second fuse with hands that trembled for reasons beyond physical pain. He had timed both devices to detonate in sequence, giving himself the margin of redundancy that earlier failures had taught the conspirators to value. The first device, now active under the table, would be the main instrument. The second, meant as insurance, would be kept for the flight home in case the first failed. As he re-entered the room and resumed his forced attention to maps and reports, the room's tone remained oblivious, the men around him still trading quips and casualty numbers, still anchored in the routines of a state that had become habituated to horror. A staff officer came in and out, a curious movement that would later be scrutinized in endless post-war analyses, and some officers shifted positions, moving a briefcase from one side of a table to another. These small human acts, a casual movement of leather, a change of chair, would have consequences no one at that hour could fully foresee. Stauffenberg's pulse, hidden by military composure, beat faster as the conference progressed and minutes slipped into the moment of truth. He had accepted that the act might cost him his life, and he had organized the coup to proceed without him if necessary. The moral gravity of his choice hung in the air between maps and ashtrays. When the bomb detonated, the world convulsed in a confined way. A violent blast, a rain of splinters of wood and shrapnel, and the sudden horrifying reality that the Führer's command might be obliterated. The blast killed some present and maimed others, collapsing the conference table and sending papers and maps flying in a chaotic airborne commentary on war's futility. For a few seconds the compound was a tableau of stunned men assessing injuries, checking pulses and crying out, yet the most crucial fact would soon become clear. Hitler, though hurt and shaken, had survived. His survival was a cruel twist that split the course of events. It created the precise condition the conspirators had tried to avoid, an assassination that failed to eliminate the person around whom the Reich's authority still revolved. Stauffenberg and Heffen, believing the Führer dead or fatally wounded, fled the scene in haste, beginning the sequence that was supposed to hand them control of Germany through the Valkyrie script. News from the Wolf's Lair moved rapidly by radio and courier, but so too did confusion, as staff officers grappled with the task of verifying deaths, accounting for the injured, and following protocol in a moment that was suddenly unprecedented. The initial terror gave way to a race between the conspirators' legalistic machine and the stubborn persistence of the Nazi security apparatus. In the minutes after the blast, the coup's fate balanced on a knife edge of rumor, timing, and the problem of proving what had actually occurred. Back in Berlin, Olbricht and other officers executed the pre-prepared Valkyrie orders, sending messages to units and activating replacement army commands. At first, many units obeyed, believing they were responding to a legitimate emergency mobilization. The forged documents carried the authority the conspirators had so painstakingly crafted, and in many cases commanders acted without question, because obedience to written command remained a core tenet of military culture. The conspirators moved rapidly to seize radio stations, to detain key Nazi functionaries, and to place officers sympathetic to the coup in command posts. In the grey corridors of the Bendlerblock, plans unfolded with grim efficiency, arrests were ordered, streets were to be secured, and emergency decrees readied. Yet, parallel to these decisive moves, the Nazi leadership's networks of loyalty and propaganda began to flex and resist. Goebbels, quick to exploit radio and rumor, worked to undermine the coup's claim to authority. The failure to confirm Hitler's death in the first chaotic hours proved catastrophic, feeding uncertainty among commanders, uncertain whether orders came from lawful authority or from rebels. The legalistic brilliance of Valkyrie collided with political reality. Paperwork could not alone command loyalty if the man at the center of the edifice still breathed. The hour-by-hour battle for legitimacy now mattered as much as any tactical seizure of buildings. As afternoon dissolved into evening, the conspirators began to grasp how fragile their victory depended on a moment that had not gone as planned. Stauffenberg, once in Berlin, and believing the Führer dead, addressed officers and broadcast messages meant to claim legitimacy for the new authority, but the winds of rumor and counterorders complicated command. Many units in the provinces hesitated, awaiting clearer proof. Others received conflicting instructions, some from the coup's own channels, and some from officers still loyal to Hitler or uncertain of the facts. Radio and telephone lines became battlefields of information, and Goebbels' skill at manipulating the airwaves allowed the Nazi leadership to paint the conspirators as traitors. Inside the Bendlerblock, the mood shifted from confident execution to clenched desperation as the net of loyalty around Hitler slowly reconstituted itself. The conspirators who had risked everything now understood that legalism, however perfectly crafted on paper, could not substitute for the mythic force of the Führer's persona when that persona remained unvanquished. Men who had prepared to seize power found themselves hunted instead, as the regime reasserted itself with growing brutality. The day's initial hope curdled into grim calculation about capture, trial, and the likely bloody aftermath. By nightfall, the coup had collapsed into a series of counterattacks by the Nazi security apparatus, and the men who had placed their faith in a fuse and in the obedience of bureaucratic machinery faced the reality of arrest and summary execution. Stauffenberg, Olbricht, Hafen, and others were detained, briefly tried by military tribunal, and then shot in the courtyard of the Bendlerblock, their death swift but public, intended as a spectacle of deterrence. The failure of the assassination and the speed of the regime's retaliation led to waves of arrests, interrogations, and executions that swept through Germany, unspooling years of clandestine networks in a matter of days. Yet the day's events were not merely a military footnote. They cracked open debates across the post-war world about courage, treason, and moral judgment under tyranny. For some Germans, and for many later historians, July 20th became a symbol of the last stand of conscience within a nation complicit in atrocity. For others at the time, it was seen simply as a treasonous act that threatened the state. In any case, the day marked a pivotal moment. Men had tried to substitute law and moral duty for the cult of personality, and though they failed, their act seeded complex legacies. The wolf's lair would stand as a grim landmark. The conspirators' gamble would echo through history as a haunting testament to the ambiguous courage of those who chose to act when most had already been silenced. At precisely 12:42 p.m., on July 20th, 1944, the serene order of Hitler's Wolf's Lair fractured into a moment of chaos that would ripple across the Reich. The briefcase containing the bomb, primed by Claus von Stauffenberg, rested innocuously beneath a thick oak conference table around which Hitler and his generals gathered. The weapon was compact but deadly, a block of British-made plastic explosive fitted with a delayed fuse designed to detonate after several minutes. Men in the room leaned over maps, their voices rising and falling in the measured cadence of military briefings. For a few moments, the bomb sat like a silent intruder, its ticking fuse unheard above the hum of discussion. Then came the eruption, a concussive roar that ripped through wood, air, and flesh, hurling debris in all directions. The force of the blast collapsed parts of the conference table, shattered windows, and sent shards of timber and metal flying like shrapnel across the room. Officers were thrown to the floor, their uniforms torn and bodies burned by the sudden wave of heat and pressure. The sound reverberated through the compound, a thunderclap that shook guards and staff alike into disbelief. In an instant, the normal rhythm of command had been replaced by an atmosphere of death, confusion, and dust. The bomb's immediate effect was brutal and indiscriminate, killing 4 men outright and severely wounding many others. Colonel Heinz Brandt, standing closest to the briefcase, suffered catastrophic injuries when the blast drove the case itself into his body, severing arteries and leaving him mortally wounded. General Rudolf Schmunt, Hitler's chief adjutant, was flung to the ground, grievously injured by splinters and blast pressure that tore through his lungs and abdomen. Other officers staggered, their eardrums shattered, their skin lacerated by flying wood and glass, and their minds reeling from the concussion. Smoke filled the room, mingling with screams and the smell of burnt clothing, blood and splintered pine. Those still conscious clawed their way toward the exits, stumbling past collapsed chairs and broken beams in a desperate search for air. The men outside, hearing the detonation, rushed into a scene that looked like a battlefield compressed into 4 walls. Blood streaked the floorboards, papers fluttered like dying birds, and the once orderly conference was reduced to a grotesque tableau of destruction. Death had arrived in the inner sanctum of the Reich, but it had not chosen the man for whom it had been intended. Hitler, by sheer fortune and the quirks of circumstance, survived the blast with only superficial injuries. The massive oak conference table, meant as a tool for map displays, acted as an unintended shield, absorbing much of the explosion's direct force. Moments earlier, an officer had shifted the briefcase further from Hitler's immediate position, placing it against a thick table leg that further deflected the deadly wave. When the device ignited, Hitler was thrown violently to the floor, his trousers scorched, his right arm badly bruised, and his eardrums temporarily ruptured. Stunned but alive, he staggered upright amid the smoke, his hair singed and his face blackened with soot. Those nearby, their vision blurred by dust, were incredulous to see him standing. To them his survival seemed uncanny, almost supernatural, reinforcing the myth that fate itself guarded the Führer. Hitler himself quickly embraced this narrative, declaring to those who rushed to his side that Providence had spared him to lead Germany to victory. What had been intended as the mortal blow to Nazism instead became the grotesque seed of renewed fanaticism. The physical devastation inside Hut 20 was a grim testimony to the bomb's potential. Walls bowed outward, glass panes were reduced to fragments, and wooden beams lay scattered like matchsticks across the floor. The ceiling cracked but did not collapse entirely, allowing sunlight to pierce through smoke and cast eerie shafts over the carnage below. Men who had been standing mere feet from one another met radically different fates. Some lay lifeless, their bodies contorted, while others clutched wounds that bled freely but were not fatal. Survivors staggered through the haze with blood on their faces, some dazed and unable to hear, others shrieking from the pain of burns and shrapnel embedded in their flesh. For minutes that seemed to stretch into hours, the room remained an arena of groans, coughing, and desperate attempts to locate survivors. Medics, rushing from nearby huts, dragged the injured into the open air, laying them out in rows along the gravel paths. The once neat garden courtyards of the Wolf's Lair became impromptu triage stations, filled with the sound of stretcher poles clattering and the frantic cries of orderlies. The briefcase bomb, though compact, had turned an orderly council into a slaughterhouse. Outside the conference hut, Confusion reigned as guards and staff scrambled to interpret what had just happened. Some thought the compound had been bombed by Soviet aircraft. Others assumed sabotage by partisans, while a few suspected an assassination attempt. Smoke billowed from the building, and the crack of broken timbers echoed as debris settled. Officers ran in every direction, shouting for order, calling out names and summoning medical teams. Stauffenberg and Haffens, who had already begun their departure from the Wolf's Lair, exploited the confusion to slip away, reporting to those they encountered that Hitler had been killed. Meanwhile, SS guards sealed the compound, erecting barriers and interrogating survivors about what they had seen. The sudden transition from ordinary staff duties to life-or-death chaos left men shaken, their minds struggling to reconcile routine with catastrophe. Radios and teleprinters hummed as initial reports of the explosion spread, but in the fog of confusion no one could yet confirm who was alive and who was dead. For a brief window of time, the conspirators' gamble seemed to have worked, for in the chaos Hitler's survival was not immediately established. That window, however, would prove tragically short. As word of the blast spread through the compound, survivors gathered around Hitler to reassure themselves that the Reich's center of gravity still stood. He appeared shaken but resolute, insisting that he had been spared to fulfill his mission. With his uniform singed and hair disheveled, he exuded a theatrical aura of survival that played perfectly into his cultivated mythology. Photographers and staff hurried to document his injuries and his defiance, framing him as the man whom fate had chosen to protect. Hitler personally summoned Goebbels and Himmler by secure phone lines, announcing that the Führer lived and that enemies within had tried to assassinate him. By placing himself at the center of the narrative, he ensured that the coup would be discredited before it fully unfurled. Staff rushed to repair communications, transmitting news that the Führer's enemies had failed. In Berlin, these announcements began to undermine the Valkyrie orders being carried out by conspirators. The visual of Hitler alive, bruised but commanding, was all it took to reassert the myth of invulnerability. A single bomb had shaken the regime but could not topple its dictator. The blast's victims embodied the random cruelty of explosive force, a lottery of survival and death determined by inches and chance. General Schmont, despite medical attention, succumbed days later to his injuries. His lungs collapsed and his body weakened beyond repair. Hans Brandt died within hours, his wounds too severe for field surgeons to treat. Others lived on in maimed condition, their bodies bearing scars that testified to how close the regime had come to collapse. For Hitler, the deaths of loyal officers were a wound that demanded vengeance, fueling his fury against the conspirators. He blamed not only individuals, but entire networks within the Wehrmacht, suspecting treachery far beyond the circle of men who had acted. The physical casualties of the explosion thus extended into political casualties. Generals who had once enjoyed Hitler's trust now found themselves scrutinized and purged. The blast's immediate victims became martyrs to the Nazi cause in propaganda, their funerals choreographed as ceremonies of loyalty. Meanwhile, the conspirators' dream of decapitating the regime was reduced to ashes and recrimination. The explosion that was meant to free Germany instead cemented a new spiral of fear. In the hours that followed, the explosion at the Wolf's Lair became both a physical and symbolic turning point. It exposed the vulnerability of Hitler's regime, but simultaneously strengthened the mythology of his personal destiny. For the conspirators, the smoke and debris seemed at first to herald victory, yet within minutes the grim reality emerged. Their carefully constructed coup machinery rested on a false premise. Hitler lived, and because he lived, the Nazi state still had its keystone. The physical force of the bomb had torn apart a room, but left the edifice of dictatorship intact. Its psychological aftermath would ripple across Germany, dividing those who had hoped for liberation from those who now clung more tightly to Hitler's myth of divine protection. For the world outside, the explosion was a near miss of history, a tantalizing moment when tyranny seemed ready to collapse but survived by inches. For the men at the Wolf's Lair, it was the day death entered their sanctum and revealed how chance could make mockery of courage. And for Hitler, it became proof of providence, a narrative that would harden his resolve and unleash his wrath upon those who dared to defy him. The explosion was not just a blast of force, but a blast of destiny, altering forever the path of resistance and repression in Nazi Germany. While smoke and chaos filled the Wolf's Lair, Berlin, the heart of the Reich and the pivot of Operation Valkyrie, descended into uncertainty that would fatally undermine the conspirators' plans. In the Bendlerblock, the German army headquarters in Berlin, General Friedrich Albrecht and his colleagues waited anxiously for confirmation that Hitler had been killed. The Valkyrie orders were drafted and ready, but their legitimacy hinged on a single fact: the death of the Führer. Without that, they feared loyal officers might hesitate or refuse to obey. Hours ticked by as teleprinter reports from Rassenberg were garbled, contradictory, or delayed by deliberate obstruction from Nazi loyalists. Rumors spread that Hitler had perished, while others claimed he had emerged miraculously alive. In this fog of half-truths, the conspirators faced a dilemma: act boldly and risk being exposed as traitors if Hitler lived, or wait and squander the fleeting momentum of surprise. The coup was meant to run like a clockwork machine. Instead, it stalled in hesitation, the gears grinding against the weight of uncertainty. In the halls of the Bendlerblock, men whispered, checked their watches, and stared at telephones that refused to deliver the clarity they craved. The chain of command in Berlin became a battlefield of hesitation, as some officers were ready to follow Valkyrie orders while others demanded proof of Hitler's death. Ludwig Beck, the former chief of the General Staff and one of the intellectual leaders of the resistance, urged immediate action, arguing that hesitation would doom the plan. Claus von Stauffenberg, freshly arrived from Rastenburg, insisted with conviction that Hitler was dead, pointing to the magnitude of the explosion and his eyewitness impression of the carnage. Yet his certainty clashed with the growing trickle of counterclaims: phone calls from the Wolf's Lair reporting Hitler's survival, updates from loyal adjutants who insisted the Führer had spoken after the blast, and whispers that Goebbels had already been informed. The coup machinery, designed to thrive on swift execution, instead found itself paralyzed by conflicting testimony. Officers who had been half-convinced conspirators suddenly wavered, unwilling to risk their careers and their lives without absolute proof. What had been envisioned as a clean handover of power now unfolded as a slow-motion collapse, with each moment of indecision eroding authority. The role of communications technology in Berlin proved decisive, as the conspirators struggled to control teleprinters, telephones, and radio broadcasts. Orders sent under Valkyrie's authority did reach some army units, but the delay in issuing them meant that the orders competed with loyalist countercommands. Teleprinter operators, often apolitical clerks loyal to procedure rather than ideology, found themselves caught in a duel of authority: which orders were real, which signatures genuine, and who truly commanded the replacement army. In some regions, units moved to arrest SS leaders as planned. In others, commanders hesitated, awaiting clarification. Meanwhile, Goebbels, a master of propaganda, seized the airwaves to broadcast Hitler's survival and paint the conspirators as traitors. Each broadcast chipped away at the fragile credibility the conspirators had built. In an age when radio carried the voice of the Reich directly into every barracks and living room, the conspirators' failure to secure it immediately allowed loyalists to shape the narrative. Thus, While paper orders activated men on the ground, the voice of Hitler himself, alive and defiant, traveled faster, unraveling the coup before it could solidify. Inside the Bendlerblock, tension thickened as the hours dragged on, and the conspirators' initial confidence gave way to confusion. Some officers, convinced the plan was faltering, withdrew into silence or slipped away under pretexts, unwilling to share the fate of the plotters. Others urged stronger measures. The arrest of Goebbels, Himmler, and Goering should proceed regardless of Hitler's survival, they argued, for the coup was the only path to end the war and restore Germany's dignity. But consensus fractured as doubts grew. Men argued in hushed tones about the legality of their actions, about whether history would judge them patriots or traitors, and about the wisdom of pressing forward in the face of uncertainty. The lack of a clear, unified voice among the conspirators eroded their credibility with subordinates and outsiders alike. Couriers moved in and out, carrying conflicting reports, while telephones rang with questions that no one dared answer decisively. The coup machinery had been built to operate with precision. Now, like a weapon misfired, it sputtered under the weight of human hesitation. One of the most critical failures of the Berlin conspirators was their inability to arrest Joseph Goebbels in the first decisive hours. Stauffenberg himself urged his colleagues to seize the propaganda minister, recognizing that control of the airwaves was as vital as control of troops. Yet General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the replacement army, wavered, refusing to commit fully without proof of Hitler's death. Fromm's indecision proved devastating. Goebbels remained free in his ministry, able to communicate directly with Hitler by telephone and coordinate countermeasures. The conspirators' hesitation allowed the regime's most dangerous propagandist to keep the narrative alive and to remind wavering officers that loyalty to the Führer still had a voice. Later, as Goebbels arranged for Hitler's phone call to be broadcast directly to skeptical commanders, the coup's credibility collapsed completely. What might have been achieved with a swift arrest became impossible once the moment was lost. The missed chance to silence the Reich's master manipulator would haunt the memory of July 20th as the error that doomed the entire operation. Meanwhile, in the provinces, commanders received the Valkyrie orders and faced the same paralyzing fog as their Berlin counterparts. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg attempted to implement the plan, arresting SS and Gestapo leaders in his sector, believing Hitler had been assassinated. Yet within hours, counter-orders reached him, and he realized the plot was unraveling. In Vienna, Munich, and other cities, replacement army units assembled and prepared to carry out Valkyrie, only to stand down when news arrived that Hitler had survived. The conspirators' reliance on centralized communication, meant to give coherence to the coup, instead spread confusion as contradictory messages arrived almost simultaneously. Officers who might have acted decisively if confronted with a single set of orders now found themselves immobilized, fearing that one misstep would brand them traitors. The coup's reliance on legitimacy, on paperwork, and the image of lawful authority became its fatal weakness once Hitler's survival was announced. In the absence of certainty, hesitation became loyalty to the regime by default. As daylight waned, the atmosphere in Berlin shifted from uncertainty to impending disaster. Reports flooded in that SS units loyal to Himmler were mobilizing, that commanders once hesitant were reaffirming their allegiance to Hitler, and that the conspirators' grip on events was slipping by the hour. Stauffenberg, still convinced the bomb had killed Hitler, argued passionately to press forward, but his voice grew isolated in a room where doubt had become suffocating. Fromm, sensing the coup was failing, turned against the conspirators to protect himself, distancing his office from their actions. Arrest lists that had once seemed instruments of control now became liabilities, evidence of treason that could be used against the men who compiled them. In the corridors of the Bendlerblock, soldiers and junior officers began to whisper that Hitler lived, and that obedience to the Führer was once again the safest course. The very building that had been intended as the nerve center of a new government instead became a prison for its plotters, sealed off from the decisive reality beyond its walls. Confusion, hesitation, and the regime's countermeasures combined into a lethal noose tightening around the resistance. By the time evening descended on Berlin, the coup had already failed in spirit, even if its final collapse was hours away. The conspirators had underestimated the speed with which the Nazi state could reassert control, and overestimated the ability of paper orders to substitute for Hitler's charisma. They had believed that obedience to bureaucracy would outweigh personal loyalty to the Führer, but July 20th proved the opposite. As soon as Hitler's survival was confirmed, bureaucratic obedience flowed back toward him like water returning to its channel. Confusion in Berlin was not a mere inconvenience. It was the decisive battlefield on which the coup was lost. Each hour of hesitation eroded the credibility of the plot, until by nightfall the conspirators were isolated, surrounded, and soon to be executed. The tragedy of July 20th was not only that a bomb failed to kill Hitler, but that hesitation and delay allowed his regime to recover with stunning speed. In the end, Berlin's confusion became the resistance's undoing, a case study in how fragile courage can be when clarity is absent. The conspirators had gambled everything on timing, and when timing faltered, so too did their dream of a Germany freed from tyranny. In the tense hours after the Wolf's Lair explosion, the conspirators in Berlin made the fateful decision to activate Operation Valkyrie, unleashing the bureaucratic machinery they had so carefully prepared. General Friedrich Olbricht gave the order to transmit Valkyrie directives across the Reich, mobilizing the replacement army under the guise of quelling an internal uprising. Teleprinters rattled with messages, stamped with official seals, commanding garrisons to seize control of key ministries, arrest SS officers, and secure communications networks. For a brief moment, the plot appeared to unfold with mechanical precision, as soldiers in Berlin and other cities moved according to orders that bore every mark of authenticity. The irony was profound. Nazi Germany's obsession with paperwork and official procedure had created the very tool by which conspirators sought to destroy it. The conspirators, emboldened by their belief that Hitler had perished, pressed forward with urgency. They envisioned the Valkyrie plan spreading like a chain reaction, each order triggering obedience, and every obedient act reinforcing the illusion of lawful continuity. Yet within this calculated storm of documents and commands lay the seeds of fragility. The entire apparatus depended on the perception that the Führer was dead. Without that perception, the gears of Valkyrie would grind against resistance, rather than turn smoothly toward revolution. In Berlin, troops of the replacement army began to assemble, their officers reading aloud the Valkyrie orders with the same matter-of-fact authority that governed any mobilization drill. Armored vehicles rolled into streets, checkpoints were erected, and detachments were dispatched toward key ministries and radio stations. To many soldiers, the activation felt routine, just another mobilization in a war where obedience to command was second nature. Few knew that they were being enlisted in a coup. Most believed they were suppressing a supposed revolt by the SS. This deception was the conspirators' genius, to frame resistance as obedience, rebellion as loyalty. In the Bendlerblock, Stauffenberg moved through corridors alive with tension, pressing officers to act decisively, while Olbricht and Ludwig Beck monitored reports trickling back from the field. For a moment, the building hummed with the energy of power being seized, as if the Reich were shifting beneath their hands. Yet even in this moment of momentum, cracks appeared. Commanders in outlying districts asked for clarification, radio operators requested confirmation, and certain officers hesitated to carry out arrests of men they had known for years. The plan, though elegant, required not only paperwork but conviction, and conviction was already faltering. One of the boldest moves under Valkyrie's activation was the attempt to neutralize the SS and Gestapo, the regime's most feared institutions. Orders were sent to replacement army units to disarm SS formations, occupy Gestapo offices, and place leaders under arrest. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg implemented the plan with striking efficiency, rounding up SS and Gestapo officers and placing them under guard. For a few hours, the French capital was in the hands of the conspirators, its Nazi enforcers bewildered and powerless. In Berlin, however, hesitation crippled similar efforts. Joseph Goebbels remained free in his propaganda ministry, continuing to broadcast Hitler's survival and directing loyalists to resist. Himmler and Göring, both targets for immediate detention, slipped through the conspirators' grasp as no one in the capital acted decisively enough to seize them. This failure to decapitate the regime's instruments of repression left the coup fatally exposed. Soldiers with Valkyrie orders in their hands marched confidently through Berlin's streets, but the heart of Nazi terror, its propaganda and secret police, beat on, undermining the illusion of authority the conspirators sought to impose. The conspirators understood that control of communication was the coup's lifeblood, and they attempted to assert dominance over teleprinters and radio transmitters. Military clerks in Berlin began sending a flood of Valkyrie directives, creating the appearance of an unfolding emergency that required immediate obedience. Yet the conspirators failed to silence the Reich's most potent voice, the radio broadcasts of Joseph Goebbels, and soon Adolf Hitler himself. When news spread that Hitler had spoken after the explosion, his voice recorded and transmitted directly into barracks and homes, the coup's credibility began to collapse. Orders to arrest SS leaders suddenly seemed suspect. Proclamations of Hitler's death were revealed as lies. Across the Reich, officers who had initially obeyed Valkyrie instructions now hesitated or reversed course, unwilling to risk treason against a leader who, according to official broadcasts, lived. The conspirators' gamble on speed and deception was undone by the regime's superior grip on narrative. For every teleprinter order that mobilized a battalion, a radio broadcast cancelled its momentum, transforming loyalty back to Hitler with a few words spoken over the air. In the battle between paper and voice, the voice triumphed. Inside the Bendlerblock, the atmosphere oscillated between triumph and dread as reports arrived from across Germany. Some regions reported successful implementation, SS leaders arrested, barracks secured, garrisons mobilized under the conspirators' control. Other reports, however, spoke of hesitation, confusion, and counter-orders from loyalist officers. Stauffenberg, convinced that Hitler was dead, urged his colleagues to ignore contradictory news and press ahead, insisting that victory required boldness. Ludwig Beck counseled persistence, believing that even if Hitler lived, the coup could still dismantle his regime by seizing the state apparatus. Yet General Fromm, the commander of the replacement army, vacillated, increasingly suspicious that he was entangled in treason. The room became a crucible of clashing wills, some desperate for decisive action, others ready to abandon the plan to save themselves. Outside, soldiers followed orders with mechanical precision, but inside, the conspirators themselves began to fracture. The coup's greatest weakness was laid bare. The machinery of Valkyrie could only function if those at its center believed in it without hesitation. Doubt was as lethal as betrayal, and it seeped into every corner of the Bendlerblock as the hours dragged on. On the streets of Berlin, ordinary citizens witnessed an eerie spectacle: columns of soldiers marching, checkpoints rising, and the rumor of a coup whispered but not confirmed. For most, the scene was bewildering. No public proclamation explained the sudden military mobilization, and Goebbels' broadcasts reassured them that the Führer still lived. Civilians who glimpsed soldiers hauling away SS officers or blocking access to ministries could not grasp the deeper meaning of what was unfolding. To them it looked like another wartime drill, another show of authority in a city accustomed to the rhythms of parades and mobilizations. The conspirators' failure to seize radio and press outlets meant that they never spoke directly to the German people, never claimed the mantle of legitimacy in the public square. Thus, while their soldiers acted with authority, their silence allowed Goebbels' words to dominate the narrative. In the war of perception, the conspirators lost the streets of Berlin before they had truly gained them. Their coup, visible in soldiers' boots and guns, was invisible in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed it. As the afternoon waned, the coup reached its high water mark. Units across Berlin stood ready. Teleprinter orders had flowed across Germany, and SS men in some regions sat disarmed in barracks. For a fleeting moment, the Reich's capital seemed on the verge of slipping into the conspirators' grasp. Yet the lack of decisive arrests and the growing certainty of Hitler's survival transformed this moment of strength into one of impending collapse. Himmler and the Gestapo began coordinating countermeasures, while loyal officers reached out to commanders to discredit Valkyrie as the work of traitors. The conspirators had built their plan on the assumption that Hitler's death would decapitate the Nazi state. Without that, their machinery had no anchor. Soldiers began to ask questions, and commanders demanded clarification. When confronted with evidence that Hitler was alive, some units simply melted away from their posts, unwilling to commit themselves further. What had looked like an orderly revolution revealed itself to be a facade built on fragile assumptions. The activation of Valkyrie, instead of ushering in a new government, became a paper storm dissolving in the wind of Hitler's survival. By evening, Operation Valkyrie in Berlin was unraveling in real time, its activation producing more confusion than control. Goebbels remained free, Hitler had spoken to the nation, and loyalist units were regaining confidence. In the Bendlerblock, panic replaced order as officers realized the coup's momentum was gone. General Fromm, eager to distance himself from treason, arrested Stauffenberg, Albrecht, Beck, and Hesse, condemning them as the authors of a failed rebellion. The Valkyrie orders, once the instrument of revolution, now served as evidence of betrayal, each document a death sentence for those who had signed or transmitted them. The machinery that had promised to save Germany from tyranny collapsed under the weight of hesitation, misinformation, and the unbroken aura of Hitler's authority. What had begun as a bold gamble to seize the state ended as a tragic demonstration of how fragile resistance could be in a dictatorship that controlled both force and narrative. Operation Valkyrie had been activated, but instead of birthing a new Germany, it delivered its conspirators into the jaws of the regime they sought to destroy. In the silence after its collapse, the echoes of missed chances and broken courage filled the halls of Berlin like a funeral march. As the evening shadows lengthened across Berlin, the fragile illusion on which the conspirators had built their plan finally disintegrated. News spread with certainty that Adolf Hitler had survived the Wolf's Lair explosion. Teleprinters clicked with official communiques confirming his survival, accompanied by reports of his injuries, but insisting on his continued command. Goebbels seized the airwaves, broadcasting Hitler's voice to the nation in a carefully staged phone call that erased any lingering doubt. Soldiers who had stood guard outside ministries under Valkyrie orders listened in silence as the unmistakable cadence of their furor filled the air. The psychological effect was devastating. Hesitation hardened into loyalty, and obedience flowed back toward the regime with an unstoppable tide. Officers who had quietly supported the coup withdrew their men, while others denounced the conspirators outright. Within the Bendlerblock, the sound of typewriters and telephones gave way to whispers of fear as the realization spread that the coup had become not a revolution but a crime. Hitler's survival did not simply undo the plot, it transformed it into treason in the eyes of the very men who had been asked to enforce it. The conspirators had gambled everything on Hitler's death, and with that linchpin removed, their authority collapsed in real time. In the provinces, commanders who had implemented Valkyrie orders reversed course, releasing SS and Gestapo officers they had detained earlier in the day. In Paris, General Stilpnagel, who had boldly arrested Nazi leaders, now found himself isolated as loyalist messages arrived, branding him a traitor. In Vienna, Munich, and Hamburg, units quietly returned to barracks, their brief mobilization erased as if it had never happened. Soldiers who had carried out orders in good faith now realized they had unwittingly participated in treason, and many scrambled to dissociate themselves before retribution descended. The Gestapo, long feared as the regime's ever-watchful eye, regained control with startling speed, fueled by loyal commanders who relayed Hitler's survival. The conspirators' dream of seizing the Reich through paperwork and procedure dissolved into the reality of a dictatorship that still breathed through its leader. Without Hitler's death, the machinery of Valkyrie had no legitimacy, and its gears ground to a halt under the weight of loyalist counterorders. Inside the Bendlerblock, panic replaced determination as officers who had once spoken confidently of a new Germany now recoiled from the consequences of their actions. General Fromm, sensing the coup's imminent collapse, abandoned any pretense of neutrality and turned on the men who had involved him. He denounced Stauffenberg, Albrecht, and their allies, insisting they had acted without his knowledge, and ordered their immediate arrest. Desperate to save his own life, Fromm shifted blame onto those who had carried the coup forward, portraying himself as a loyal servant of Hitler, betrayed by ambitious traitors. The conspirators, once united by a vision of resistance, now faced betrayal from within their own circle. Stauffenberg, still resolute, argued passionately that the coup must continue, but his words rang hollow in a room where fear had suffocated courage. Guards loyal to Fromm moved through the Bendlerblock, disarming men who hours earlier had believed themselves the architects of Germany's salvation. The uprising, once filled with the energy of defiance, now shrank into a corner of a single building, its leaders surrounded by the very army they had sought to command. The conspirators' attempts to salvage their plan in the face of collapse only deepened the tragedy of the moment. Teleprinter messages continued to be drafted, but few units obeyed them now that Hitler's survival was confirmed. Officers who might have acted decisively earlier in the day now demanded explanations or remained silent, unwilling to risk being swept up in the aftermath. The conspirators debated whether to seize radio stations, arrest Goebbels, or appeal directly to the public, but each idea faltered under the crushing reality that Hitler was alive and still the head of the Reich. The urgency of the morning had evaporated, replaced by a creeping paralysis. Fear seeped into every decision, and hesitation became the conspirators' final act of self-sabotage. Outside, the streets of Berlin reflected this uncertainty. Troops once deployed under Valkyrie orders stood idle, unsure whom they served, while civilians whispered rumors of a coup gone wrong. In the battle for perception, the conspirators had lost utterly, and with that loss their grip on power slipped through their fingers like sand. Stauffenberg, defiant to the end, refused to accept that Hitler had survived, insisting that the explosion must have killed him. He argued that the coup should press forward regardless, that the fate of Germany demanded action even if Hitler still breathed. But his conviction was no longer enough to rally those around him. Ulbricht, Beck, and Hedefin, his closest allies in the Bendlerblock, recognized the inevitability of defeat, even as they clung to their sense of duty. Their discussions became a tragic mixture of resolve and despair as they prepared for the consequences they knew would soon arrive. Outside their chambers, the atmosphere of betrayal thickened, with officers quietly aligning themselves with Fromm or slipping away into the night. The conspirators had begun the day believing they would be remembered as liberators. By nightfall they understood they would die as traitors in the eyes of the regime. Stauffenberg's defiance, though admirable, could not breathe life back into a coup that had already bled out on the battlefield of perception. His faith in destiny collided with the crushing machinery of dictatorship, leaving him isolated in courage but defeated in reality. As news of Hitler's survival spread further, the Nazi regime regained its footing with terrifying efficiency. Himmler mobilized SS and Gestapo forces to round up suspects, while Goebbels worked tirelessly to frame the conspirators as cowardly opportunists. Radio broadcasts across Germany celebrated Hitler's miraculous escape from death, portraying it as evidence of divine providence and his unbreakable bond with destiny. The regime painted the conspirators not as patriots but as traitors who had stabbed the nation in the back in its darkest hour. Public opinion, shaped entirely by propaganda, turned swiftly against the resistance. Civilians whispered about the coup in fear, not admiration, and many distanced themselves from anyone rumored to be involved. The Nazi narrative, reinforced by Hitler's survival, suffocated any chance that the conspirators' motives might be understood. The plot's collapse was not just political but psychological. The German people, battered by war and conditioned by propaganda, found solace in believing their Führer was untouchable. For the conspirators, this meant that even their deaths would be cloaked in infamy, their heroism buried beneath the weight of propaganda's lies. By late evening, the Bendlerblock was no longer a headquarters for revolution, but a trap for its architects. Soldiers loyal to Fromm secured the building, cutting off communication lines and preparing to turn the conspirators over to higher authorities. The conspirators, stripped of their brief aura of command, were now prisoners in the very offices from which they had sought to command Germany. Beck, the elder statesman of the resistance, quietly prepared for death, recognizing that his long struggle against Hitler was ending in failure. Ulbricht and Hedefin stood solemnly beside Stauffenberg, who remained fiery in spirit but increasingly resigned to his fate. Outside, SS reinforcements moved through the city, hunting down any lingering signs of rebellion. The coup, once envisioned as a lightning strike that would paralyze the Nazi state, had burned out into a smoldering ember. The conspirators' last hours in the Bendlerblock were filled with whispered farewells, hurried confessions, and the grim acceptance that history would not be written as they had hoped. The collapse of the plot on July 20th was not sudden but agonizing, a slow disintegration of courage under the weight of Hitler's survival and the regime's counterattack. The conspirators had misjudged the fragility of dictatorship, believing that killing the leader would unravel the state. Instead, they discovered that dictatorship's true strength lay not only in its leader, but in the machinery of propaganda, fear, and obedience that surrounded him. With Hitler alive, that machinery surged back to life with a vengeance, crushing the resistance before it could establish itself. By midnight, the dream of Valkyrie was dead, its leaders under arrest, and its soldiers dispersed. What had begun with such precision and hope ended in betrayal, confusion, and execution. The collapse was not merely a military failure, but a tragic commentary on the difficulty of resisting tyranny from within. The conspirators had fought against impossible odds, and when their gamble failed, The full weight of Nazi vengeance bore down upon them. In the ashes of their collapse lay a haunting truth: courage alone could not defeat a system built on fear, and destiny had chosen to spare Hitler once more. As the clock neared midnight on July 20th, 1944, the Bendlerblock, once envisioned as the nerve center of a new Germany, became the stage for the swift and brutal collapse of the conspiracy. General Friedrich Fromm, desperate to erase his own complicity in the day's events, acted decisively against the men who had dragged him into treason. In a sudden reversal, he ordered the arrest of Claus von Stauffenberg, General Friedrich Albrecht, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, and Lieutenant Werner von Heffen, soldiers of the replacement army, who only hours earlier had obeyed Valkyrie commands from these men, now turned their rifles against them. The conspirators, their faces illuminated by the dim lights of the Bendlerblock's corridors, did not resist. They knew the coup had failed, and that the machinery of vengeance was already in motion. Fromm, playing the part of a loyalist, denounced them as criminals and insisted they must be executed immediately to demonstrate his allegiance to Hitler. The irony was sharp. A man who had vacillated all day, waiting to see which side would triumph, now positioned himself as the executioner of those who had dared to act. The stage was set for a grim finale, carried out with ruthless haste. The conspirators were confined briefly, given little time to speak or prepare themselves for what was to come. Stauffenberg remained resolute, his defiance undimmed even as guards stripped him of his authority. Albrecht, weary and resigned, carried the demeanor of a man who had long understood the cost of resistance. Merz von Quernheim moved with the calm of a soldier accepting his duty's final command. Haffen, the youngest of the group, displayed quiet loyalty, determined to face death alongside his commander. No trial was convened, no formal charges read. The proceedings were carried out with the urgency of men eager to absolve themselves by blood. Outside, Berlin's streets were eerily quiet, the failed coup already fading into rumor, while within the Bendlerblock, history contracted into a few desperate hours. The conspirators exchanged glances, silent acknowledgments of shared sacrifice, their voices stilled by the knowledge that words could no longer change fate. The air was thick with fear and inevitability, every moment heavy with the finality of approaching death. The machine of repression, once challenged, now reasserted itself with ruthless speed. In this compressed crucible of time, courage met its end in silence and dignity. Fromm convened a makeshift tribunal of sorts, though it was nothing more than a facade for summary execution. He declared that the conspirators had committed high treason, and that their punishment would be immediate death by firing squad. This decision was driven less by loyalty to Hitler than by his own instinct for survival, for Fromm feared that Himmler's SS would soon arrive and take control of the prisoners. By executing the plotters himself, he hoped to demonstrate his loyalty and shield himself from suspicion. The accused men were marched into the Bendlerblock courtyard under guard, their footsteps echoing across the cobblestones in the stillness of the night. Soldiers assembled in haste, rifles loaded, their expressions betraying unease at the task before them. These were not hardened executioners, but ordinary troops suddenly transformed into instruments of vengeance. Some averted their eyes, others gripped their rifles tightly, as the reality of killing fellow officers, men of high rank and reputation, weighed heavily on their shoulders. Yet orders were orders, and obedience defined the moment. In this courtyard, duty to command triumphed over conscience, sealing the fate of the conspirators. The first to die was Friedrich Albrecht, who had played a central role in drafting Valkyrie and transmitting its orders. He stood calmly before the firing squad, his posture upright, his demeanor one of weary acceptance. He made no final speech, offering only a silent nod as the rifles cracked, and his body crumpled to the ground. Next was Albrecht Mertz von Krienheim, who faced the squad with quiet dignity, his loyalty to Stauffenberg unwavering to the last. His execution was swift, a blur of sound and smoke in the courtyard's darkness. Werner von Haiefen followed, but before he could be shot, he stepped forward with a sudden burst of courage. In an act of loyalty that stunned even the guards, he threw himself in front of Stauffenberg, taking bullets meant for his commander. His sacrifice was immediate and absolute, a final gesture of devotion that immortalized him as a symbol of comradeship. Each execution added to the grim rhythm of the night, the courtyard becoming a theater of sacrifice, where ideals clashed with bullets. The conspirators' deaths, though brutal, carried a sense of defiance that no firing squad could extinguish. Claus von Stauffenberg was the last to face the rifles, the man whose courage had carried the bomb into the wolf's lair that morning. Despite his severe injuries, one eye, one hand, and several fingers lost to earlier wounds, he stood tall, embodying the defiance of the resistance. Refusing a blindfold, he gazed at his executioners with unwavering eyes, a soldier unbroken even in defeat. His voice rang out across the courtyard in a cry that history would remember, "Long live Holy Germany." The words, echoing in the night air, carried the weight of sacrifice and conviction, a final declaration of loyalty to the nation he had sought to save. The rifles cracked, and Stauffenberg's body fell beside his comrades, his blood mingling with theirs on the cobblestones. In that moment, the Bendlerblock became both a grave and a monument, consecrated by the defiance of men who had gambled everything against tyranny. The firing squad lowered their rifles, the courtyard fell silent, and the conspirators' dream of liberation ended in the darkness of July 20th. Yet their deaths planted seeds that would grow in memory long after the regime that killed them crumbled. Inside the Bendlerblock, silence replaced the echo of gunfire, but the consequences of the executions reverberated far beyond its walls. Word of the summary shooting spread quickly, carried by whispers among soldiers and clerks who had witnessed them. Some felt relief that the ordeal was over, while others felt shame at having watched men of honor executed without trial. The conspirators' deaths were meant to serve as a warning, a demonstration that even the highest-ranking officers were not immune to Hitler's wrath. Yet their courage also inspired quiet admiration, even among those who dared not voice it. In the hours that followed, Gestapo agents arrived, seizing documents, arresting suspects, and beginning the vast wave of repression that would consume thousands. The Bendlerblock, once alive with the energy of rebellion, now stood as a fortress of fear, its walls bearing silent witness to the night's bloodshed. For the Nazi regime, the executions were a triumph of terror. For history, they were a testament to resistance's enduring spirit. The courtyard, stained with blood, became the first memorial of a plot that had failed in action but succeeded in honor. The immediacy of the executions was matched by the swiftness of Nazi propaganda in framing them. Within hours, the regime portrayed the conspirators as cowardly opportunists who had sought power for themselves, while Germany fought for survival. Newspapers and broadcasts painted them as traitors, condemning their motives and erasing any notion of patriotism from their actions. Yet among those who had known them, a different narrative took root. To their families, colleagues, and quiet sympathizers, they were men of conscience who had risked everything to end a tyranny that had destroyed Germany's honor. This duality, traitors in the regime's eyes, heroes in history's, would define their legacy. The Bendlerblock, transformed overnight from a command center to an execution site, stood as the embodiment of this tragic tension. In its courtyard, Loyalty and betrayal had intertwined, creating a story too powerful for propaganda to fully erase. Even as the Nazi regime tightened its grip, the memory of those executions began to form the foundation of a counter-narrative that would endure long after the guns fell silent. The arrests and executions at the Bendlerblock marked the brutal end of the coup, but also the beginning of its transformation into legend. Stauffenberg and his comrades had failed to kill Hitler and failed to overthrow the regime, but their courage in the face of certain death elevated their cause beyond politics. Their defiance, crystallized in the gunfire of that night, became a symbol of moral resistance in a nation consumed by fear. Though the Nazi state sought to erase them through propaganda and terror, their sacrifice endured in memory, carried by survivors, and later recognized by a liberated Germany. The courtyard where they fell became hallowed ground, a reminder of both the price of resistance and the cost of hesitation. In their deaths, the conspirators achieved what their coup could not. They exposed the vulnerability of tyranny and the enduring power of conscience. The executions were not the end of Valkyrie's story, but its transformation into a moral legacy, one that history would reclaim from the silence of that dark Berlin night. In death they achieved immortality, their courage echoing far beyond the walls that had witnessed their fall. The failed coup of July 20th, 1944, unleashed not only Nazi propaganda, but also Hitler's unrelenting fury, which he transformed into a campaign of purges designed to eradicate dissent in every corner of the Reich. In the hours following his miraculous survival, Hitler spoke with venom to his inner circle, vowing that every conspirator, every sympathizer, and even those who merely hesitated would pay with their lives. He considered the assassination attempt not only a personal insult but an act of treason that had violated the sacred bond between the Führer and his Volk. Determined to demonstrate that no betrayal would be tolerated, he authorized Heinrich Himmler and the Gestapo to root out conspirators with ruthless efficiency. Lists were drawn up overnight, containing the names of generals, politicians, clerics, and even aristocrats suspected of wavering loyalty. Soldiers, clerks, and secretaries who had touched a Valkyrie order suddenly found themselves under suspicion. The coup, though confined in reality to a small circle, was inflated into a vast conspiracy by Nazi propaganda, ensuring that fear and suspicion spread like wildfire. Hitler's revenge would not be measured in justice, but in blood and terror. The first wave of arrests struck like a lightning storm, falling upon senior officers of the Wehrmacht and members of the aristocratic elite who had been connected to the plot. Henning von Treschow, one of the early masterminds of the resistance, chose suicide on the Eastern Front rather than risk capture, detonating a grenade to deny the Gestapo the satisfaction of a trial. General Ludwig Beck, who had been arrested in the Bendlerblock, attempted to shoot himself but failed. He was executed soon after. Karl Goerdeler, the former mayor of Leipzig and intended chancellor in the conspirators' new government, was dragged into Gestapo custody and tortured mercilessly for weeks before his trial. Officers across Germany who had expressed even mild criticism of Hitler were swept into the dragnet as the regime used July 20th as an excuse to cleanse the army of dissenters. The Gestapo interrogations were brutal, designed not only to extract confessions but to implicate others, creating an expanding web of accusations. Fear became a weapon as powerful as any gun, and the Wehrmacht, once a bastion of tradition and pride, bent further under the regime's control. Central to Hitler's revenge was the notorious People's Court, presided over by the infamous judge Roland Freisler, a former Nazi ideologue and legal zealot. Freisler transformed the courtroom into a grotesque stage where justice was replaced by humiliation. Dressed in his black robe, He berated defendants with theatrical rage, screaming insults, mocking their patriotism, and denying them even the dignity of a defense. Trials lasted only hours, sometimes minutes, as guilt was predetermined, and sentences foregone conclusions. Cameras rolled during the proceedings, recording the humiliation of aristocrats, generals, and statesmen who had once stood at the pinnacle of German society. These films were later shown to Hitler and other Nazi leaders, who delighted in watching their enemies squirm before the court. The spectacle was designed not for truth but for terror, ensuring that anyone contemplating resistance would see only degradation and death awaiting them. Freisler's courtroom became the theater of Hitler's vengeance, where law was twisted into a weapon of psychological warfare. The executions that followed were carried out with deliberate cruelty, intended to maximize suffering and send a chilling message to the German people. Many of the condemned were hanged by piano wire, their deaths filmed for Hitler's personal amusement. Unlike swift military executions by firing squad, these deaths were slow and agonizing, designed to strip the victims of dignity. The condemned were forced to wear tattered clothing, their hands bound, and their final moments filmed by Gestapo cameramen who preserved their suffering as trophies. Among the most shocking cases was General Erwin von Witzleben, once one of Germany's most respected commanders, stripped of his belt and braces so his trousers fell during trial. He was mocked mercilessly by Freisler before being sent to the gallows. Such deliberate humiliation ensured that the executions were remembered as acts of revenge rather than justice. For Hitler, the method of death mattered. It had to erase not only the conspirators' lives, but also their honor. The regime weaponized degradation as a final punishment, ensuring their victims were broken in body and spirit before execution. The scale of the purges extended far beyond the July 20th conspirators, sweeping into circles that had only brushed against resistance. Families of those arrested were subjected to the principle of Sippenhaft, or kin liability, where relatives were punished for the crimes of their kin. Wives, children, and parents of conspirators were arrested, interrogated, and sent to concentration camps, their only crime being the blood they shared with a traitor. Stauffenberg's wife, Nina, was imprisoned along with her children, and though she survived the war, she endured immense suffering as the regime sought to erase her husband's legacy. Friends, secretaries, and colleagues of conspirators were also pulled into the Gestapo's net, enduring beatings and imprisonment. This widening circle of repression turned the coup into an opportunity for the regime to tighten its grip over the Wehrmacht and civilian society alike. Hitler's revenge was indiscriminate, spilling beyond the conspirators themselves and ensuring that fear silenced not only officers but entire families. The message was unmistakable: resistance would destroy not only the individual but all those they loved. The Nazi propaganda machine worked tirelessly to frame the July 20th conspirators as cowardly and self-serving traitors, erasing the nobility of their motives from public discourse. Posters and articles described them as aristocratic elitists who had turned against the people in Germany's hour of greatest need. Radio broadcasts painted them as would-be usurpers who sought to seize power for their own ends, ignoring their genuine desire to end the war and save Germany from destruction. By portraying the conspirators as corrupt and dishonorable, the regime undermined any potential sympathy they might have inspired. The propaganda was effective for the German public, already cowed by years of surveillance and repression, had little reason to doubt the regime's narrative. In cafes and on street corners, whispers of the assassination attempt spread, but they were laced with caution, for one never knew who might be listening. The memory of July 20th was buried beneath layers of propaganda, and the conspirators' names became synonymous with betrayal in the Nazi-controlled press. This manipulation of memory was itself part of Hitler's revenge, to destroy not only the men but also the meaning of their resistance. As the weeks stretched into months, the purge expanded relentlessly, claiming the lives of hundreds of officers, officials, and civilians connected, however loosely, to the plot. Henning von Trescow's fellow conspirators on the Eastern Front were hunted down, interrogated, and executed. General Erich Feldgebel, who had cut communications on July 20th, was hanged. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of military intelligence and long suspected of double dealings, was eventually implicated, dismissed, and later executed in a concentration camp. Even those who had played minor roles, such as couriers or informants, found themselves dragged before Freisler's court and condemned. The sheer breadth of the purge demonstrated Hitler's determination not only to punish but to terrorize, ensuring that no officer would dare question his authority again. Fear replaced doubt in the Wehrmacht, solidifying Hitler's control at the very moment when Germany's military fortunes were collapsing. The July 20th plot, intended to liberate Germany, instead deepened its enslavement as the Führer's wrath spread like a poison through every level of society. The wave of purges and trials following the July 20th plot revealed the full extent of Hitler's obsession with vengeance and control. What could have been remembered as a noble stand against tyranny was transformed, through propaganda, show trials, and executions, into a warning etched in blood. The People's Court under Roland Freisler became a symbol of perverted justice, where law served dictatorship rather than truth. The executions by hanging, the use of humiliation, and the targeting of families demonstrated the regime's intent to erase not only resistance, but the very idea that resistance was possible. Yet, in attempting to destroy the legacy of the conspirators, Hitler inadvertently immortalized them. Their defiance in the face of death, their dignity under humiliation, and their sacrifice for conscience stood in stark contrast to the regime's cruelty. While the Nazi state tightened its grip in the short term, history would later reclaim July 20th as a moment of moral courage. In the dark summer of 1944, however, the conspirators' dream was buried under the weight of Hitler's revenge, and the Reich sank deeper into the abyss of tyranny. In the weeks following July 20th, 1944, the German resistance network unraveled under the relentless machinery of Nazi retribution. The Gestapo, emboldened by Hitler's survival, launched a merciless hunt that spared no one, dragging suspects from their homes, offices, and even frontline positions. Men who had once whispered of conscience and duty in hushed tones were now silenced forever in prison cells and execution chambers. General Ludwig Beck, the intellectual anchor of the movement, had already attempted suicide in the Bendlerblock, but lingered long enough to be finished by loyalist officers. His death was symbolic. The quiet philosopher general, who had believed in a Germany freed from tyranny, now reduced to another casualty of a regime that brooked no dissent. The Gestapo scoured Beck's circle, arresting anyone connected to his plans, expanding the dragnet far beyond the original conspirators. With every arrest, the fragile web of resistance snapped thread by thread, leaving those still free in isolation and despair. In the aftermath, what had once been an organized movement of conscience became scattered fragments of broken lives. The dream of reform that Beck had embodied dissolved into silence, preserved only in the memory of those who dared to recall it. Karl Goedeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, an intended chancellor of a post-Hitler Germany, faced one of the most agonizing fates of all. Arrested soon after the failed coup, he endured months of brutal interrogation at the hands of the Gestapo, who sought to pry from him names of fellow conspirators. Despite severe torture and psychological pressure, Goedeler resisted giving away the full extent of the network, protecting many by silence. His trial before Roland Freisler's People's Court was a grotesque performance, where he was mocked, humiliated, and condemned as a traitor. Yet Goedel's demeanor betrayed a deep sense of moral conviction. He spoke openly of his belief that Hitler had led Germany into ruin, and that resistance had been a duty, not a crime. His execution by hanging in February 1945 was carried out with calculated cruelty, ensuring his final moments were both painful and degrading. To the regime, his death symbolized the destruction of the resistance's civilian leadership. To history, it symbolized the persistence of conscience under tyranny. Goedel's loss was more than personal. It deprived Germany of a statesman who had sought to restore its dignity through peace, justice, and law. Henning von Treschow, the brilliant strategist of the Eastern Front resistance, chose to meet his end on his own terms rather than fall into Gestapo hands. When news of the failed coup reached him, he calmly walked into the woods near the front and detonated a grenade, ensuring his death was quick and his secret secure. His suicide was both a final act of defiance and a shield for his comrades, for without his confession, the Gestapo would struggle to unravel the full depth of his involvement. Treschow left behind words that would echo through history, declaring that the attempt on Hitler's life had been made to show the world and history that the men of the resistance had dared to act. His death was the silencing of one of the most brilliant military minds of the conspiracy, a man whose strategic insight had shaped multiple plots against Hitler. The Gestapo, denied the chance to parade him through Friesler's court, nevertheless turned its vengeance upon his family and associates. Treschow's name, reviled in Nazi propaganda, survived as a beacon of defiance in later generations. His sacrifice, though unseen in the moment, ensured that history would remember that courage had existed within the ranks of the Wehrmacht. Beyond the most famous names, countless lesser-known figures in the resistance network met equally brutal fates, their stories buried beneath the avalanche of executions. Officers like General Erich Feldgebel, who had cut communications at the Wolf's Lair, were hanged in Plötzensee prison. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, long suspected of disloyalty, was eventually ensnared in the dragnet, imprisoned and executed in Flossenburg concentration camp in April 1945. Civilian supporters, from secretaries who typed coup orders to couriers who carried messages, were arrested, tortured, and often killed. The breadth of the purge revealed the depth of Hitler's rage. The July 20th conspiracy, though confined in numbers, became the justification for a campaign of repression that consumed hundreds. Friends, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances of conspirators found themselves accused, dragged into Friesler's court, and condemned with little evidence beyond association. The Gestapo ensured that the resistance was not only destroyed but obliterated, reduced to scattered fragments of memory hidden among survivors. Yet each of these individuals, however small their role, became part of a collective sacrifice, woven into the larger tapestry of defiance. Their deaths, though nameless to most, carried the same weight of conscience as those of the leaders. The fate of the resistance network extended beyond execution chambers, reaching into the lives of families left behind. The Nazi principle of Sippenhaft, kin liability, ensured that wives, children, and even distant relatives of conspirators paid for their connection in suffering. Families of Beck, Goedel, and Stauffenberg were arrested, interrogated, and sent to camps, their lives shattered by association. Nina von Stauffenberg, pregnant at the time of her husband's death, was imprisoned, and her children were scattered under false names in Nazi institutions. Children of other conspirators were likewise taken from their homes, taught to despise their fathers as traitors, and stripped of their heritage. For many, survival was possible only after the Reich fell, when they were reunited with broken lives and unhealed wounds. The Nazi regime understood that terror worked most effectively when it poisoned bloodlines, ensuring resistance would be remembered as a curse rather than an honor. In targeting families, Hitler struck not only at individuals, but at memory itself, seeking to erase even the possibility of future defiance. These acts of cruelty expanded the tragedy of the resistance, ensuring its shadow touched far more lives than those who had raised their hands in conspiracy. The destruction of the resistance network revealed the peril of dissent in a dictatorship where surveillance and fear were omnipresent. The Gestapo used the failure of Valkyrie to justify tightening its stranglehold, rooting out anyone suspected of wavering loyalty. Army officers, once proud of their independence, now found themselves watched closely, their loyalty tested, and their words scrutinized. Civilians, too, retreated further into silence, fearful that even a whisper of criticism could bring suspicion of treason. The July 20th conspiracy, though noble in intent, inadvertently deepened the climate of fear, showing the German people that resistance could not succeed and would only bring annihilation. Yet within this suffocating atmosphere, seeds of remembrance were sown. Some soldiers admired the conspirators' courage in secret, even as they obeyed the regime outwardly. Civilians who learned of their motives in whispers carried those stories quietly, ensuring they survived the war's end. The fate of the resistance network was thus twofold: destruction in the short term, survival in memory. While the Gestapo sought to erase it, history would later resurrect it as proof that conscience had not entirely died in Nazi Germany. By early 1945, the resistance network was shattered beyond repair, its leaders executed, its members scattered, and its families destroyed. Yet the regime's vengeance, though thorough, could not erase the ideals for which they had fought. As Allied armies closed in on Germany, surviving conspirators in prisons and camps faced execution in a final frenzy of bloodletting. Canaris, Oster, and other military resistors were killed in the last months, their bodies buried in unmarked graves as the Reich collapsed. The People's Court continued its grotesque performances until Freisler himself was killed in an air raid, collapsing under the ruins of his own justice system. Even in its final moments, the regime sought to extract revenge from the remnants of the resistance, proving that Hitler's fury remained undiminished until the very end. Yet in those final executions, the moral contrast was stark, men of conscience dying with dignity, while the regime that killed them disintegrated into chaos. The fate of the resistance network was sealed in blood, but its story endured, carried forward by survivors, and eventually by liberated Germany. The deaths of Beck, Goerdeler, Tresco, and countless others marked the tragic end of Germany's most significant attempt to overthrow Hitler from within. Their fates underscored both the bravery and the futility of resistance in a regime fortified by fear, propaganda, and absolute control. Yet their sacrifices, though crushed in the moment, resonated beyond their deaths. After the war, their names were resurrected as symbols of moral courage, reclaiming honor for a nation tarnished by tyranny. The Gestapo and Freisler had sought to erase them from history, but in time they became pillars of remembrance, celebrated in schools, memorials, and public discourse. Their network, destroyed in body, survived in spirit, offering proof that not all Germans had followed Hitler blindly. In the ashes of the failed coup lay the seeds of redemption, for their defiance testified that conscience had lived even in the heart of the Reich. The fate of the resistance network was a tragedy, but also a legacy, one that history preserved against the regime's effort to bury it. Through their deaths they achieved what their coup could not. They became immortal witnesses against tyranny. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the legacy of the July 20th plot was contested, shrouded in ambiguity, and burdened by the complexities of memory in a defeated nation. To the Nazi regime that still lingered in people's minds, the conspirators had been traitors who tried to stab the fatherland in the back during its darkest hour. This narrative did not vanish overnight in May 1945, for many Germans, exhausted by war and wary of acknowledging guilt, were hesitant to embrace men who had acted against their own leader. For some, especially soldiers who had fought to the end, the conspirators remained figures of suspicion, their courage overshadowed by perceptions of betrayal. Yet for others, particularly among intellectuals and survivors of the camps, the conspirators' actions became a glimmer of moral conscience within the abyss of tyranny. Their attempt, however doomed, testified that not all Germans had followed Hitler blindly into destruction. The paradox of their legacy lay in this duality, celebrated abroad as heroes of resistance, yet debated at home as either visionaries or traitors. The shadow of the Reich weighed heavily on their memory, complicating the story of who they truly were. During the early years of Allied occupation, the July 20th conspirators were framed in contrasting lights by different powers. In the Western zones, particularly under American and British administration, they were increasingly recognized as men who had risked everything to save Germany from disaster. Allied authorities sought to elevate their memory as part of the effort to build a democratic Germany rooted in moral courage. In the Soviet zone, however, the conspirators were viewed with suspicion, their aristocratic backgrounds and conservative politics at odds with communist ideology. To Soviet propagandists, they were not heroes but opportunists who had acted too late and too little, seeking to preserve their class interests rather than liberate the German people. This divergence in interpretation meant that the July 20th plot became yet another fault line in Cold War Germany, remembered with reverence in the West, but derided or ignored in the East. The conspirators' legacy was thus divided by borders, caught between two competing visions of post-war Germany. Their story was not simply about resistance, but about the politics of memory in a fractured nation. In West Germany, the rehabilitation of the conspirators was gradual, shaped by shifting cultural and political needs in the early Federal Republic. During the 1950s, as the nation rebuilt itself and sought stability, public discussion of July 20th remained muted, overshadowed by efforts to integrate former soldiers into society and avoid reopening wounds. Many veterans regarded Stauffenberg and his allies with suspicion, viewing them as men who had betrayed their oath to Hitler. Yet intellectual circles, churches, and survivor groups began to push for recognition of the conspirators as moral actors who had acted on conscience. Gradually, schools and civic organizations began to frame them as symbols of integrity, particularly as West Germany sought to distance itself from the Nazi past. By the 1960s, ceremonies commemorating July 20th gained official recognition, with presidents and chancellors attending memorials at the Bendlerblock. This shift marked a turning point. The conspirators were no longer viewed as traitors, but as men who had fought to reclaim Germany's honor. Their legacy, though still debated, became a cornerstone of democratic identity in West Germany. In East Germany, by contrast, the July 20th plotters were condemned as reactionary aristocrats who had no true interest in the liberation of the people. The communist regime glorified resistance only when it aligned with socialist ideals, such as the activities of communist groups in concentration camps or underground labor networks. Stauffenberg, Beck, and Goerdeler were dismissed as elitists who had sought to replace Hitler with their own conservative rule. In East German textbooks and propaganda, the July 20th plot was minimized or ignored, overshadowed by narratives that portrayed communists as the sole true resistors to fascism. This selective memory erased the diversity of German resistance and ensured that generations in the East grew up with little awareness of the coup attempt. The conspirators' moral and political courage was thus denied to half of Germany, their story reframed as one of selfish ambition rather than selfless sacrifice. Only after reunification in 1990 did their memory regain balance across the nation, allowing a fuller recognition of their place in German history. Until then, their legacy remained as divided as the country itself. Internationally, the July 20th plot gained recognition as one of the most significant acts of internal resistance against Hitler. In Britain and the United States, where the conspirators had hoped for support during the war, their memory was embraced as proof that conscience had existed within Germany. Historians, journalists, and filmmakers in the post-war decades presented Stauffenberg as the embodiment of a German officer who had rejected blind obedience. His bomb, though failing to kill Hitler, had symbolically shattered the myth of total German complicity. In Israel and among Jewish communities, however, the conspirators' legacy was more complex. Some praised their courage, while others noted bitterly that their actions came only after years of silence during the Holocaust. Why, critics asked, did they act only when Germany was losing the war, rather than when millions of Jews were being murdered? This question haunted their legacy, ensuring that admiration was always tempered by scrutiny. The world remembered them as men of courage, but also as men of delay, their heroism overshadowed by the enormity of what had already been lost. As the decades passed, the July 20th plot became a subject of cultural remembrance, shaping the moral education of Germany's future generations. Memorials were erected at the Bendlerblock, the site of the executions, where each year wreaths were laid and speeches given to honor the conspirators. Films, books, and plays revisited their story, dramatizing the tension of the day and the defiance of men who had gambled everything against tyranny. School curricula integrated their actions as examples of moral courage, teaching students that loyalty to conscience outweighed loyalty to authority. Their legacy thus became a cornerstone of democratic Germany, a reminder that the nation's past contained not only complicity, but also defiance. Yet the commemorations were not mere ritual, they carried a warning. The conspirators' fate showed how difficult resistance could be under dictatorship, and how the price of conscience was often paid in blood. Their legacy was not only one of inspiration, but also one of sobering truth. Courage does not guarantee success, and morality often collides with tragedy. The July 20th conspirators were also woven into Germany's political identity, shaping how the nation understood itself in the post-war era. For leaders of the Federal Republic, honoring Stauffenberg and his allies was a way to reclaim a sense of national dignity, proving that not all Germans had bowed to Hitler. Their story offered a moral counterweight to the shame of Auschwitz and the destruction of war, a way to demonstrate to the world that conscience had survived even under dictatorship. Yet their legacy also carried tension. To celebrate them was to acknowledge how few had resisted, and how late that resistance had come. This duality gave their memory both power and discomfort, forcing Germany to confront its past honestly, while also drawing strength from the example of courage. In this way, the conspirators became not only historical figures, but moral symbols, embodying the struggle between obedience and conscience that remains relevant in every era. Their legacy thus transcended history, offering lessons on resistance, morality, and the duty to act against tyranny. Today, the legacy of the July 20th plot is one of both tragedy and triumph, etched deeply into Germany's national consciousness. The conspirators are remembered not as traitors but as heroes, men who dared to act when silence was the safer course. Their memorials stand as reminders that resistance is possible, even under the weight of totalitarianism, and that conscience, though crushed in the moment, can outlive tyranny. Yet their story also carries a haunting lesson. Courage delayed is courage diminished, and moral action must not wait until defeat makes it convenient. The duality of their legacy ensures that their memory is not romanticized but understood in all its complexity. They were flawed men shaped by their time, but they were also visionaries who sought to reclaim Germany's honor. Their failure illuminated the power of dictatorship, while their sacrifice illuminated the enduring strength of conscience. In the ruins of July 20th lies a truth that resonates far beyond its moment, that resistance, however fragile, is the seed of renewal, and that even in defeat, courage leaves a legacy that tyranny can never erase. The story of Operation Valkyrie is more than the tale of a failed coup. It is a meditation on the complexities of courage and the moral weight of resistance under dictatorship. In a world suffocated by fear, where surveillance and violence silenced dissent, the conspirators' decision to act marked an extraordinary break with obedience. Their courage lay not only in plotting to kill Hitler, but in daring to imagine a different Germany, one in which conscience mattered more than blind loyalty. Yet this courage existed within limits. Many resisted too late, too cautiously, or only when military defeat made action seem necessary. The paradox of Valkyrie is that it embodied both bravery and hesitation, both vision and compromise. To judge them solely as heroes risks oversimplification. To condemn them as opportunists ignores the enormity of what they attempted. Their legacy, therefore, demands nuance, a recognition of their moral strength, tempered by an acknowledgement of their human failings. In the end, Valkyrie teaches us that courage under tyranny is rarely pure, but always essential. The lessons of Valkyrie force us to confront the very nature of morality in times of oppression. For years, many Germans remained silent or complicit, rationalizing obedience as survival, loyalty, or duty. The conspirators, however, crossed a line that most never dared to approach, affirming that moral obligation can outweigh personal safety and sworn oaths. They remind us that morality under dictatorship is not an abstract concept but a lived experience, tested daily by choices between complicity and conscience. Yet their delay highlights a painful truth. Resistance that comes late cannot undo earlier silence, nor can it erase the crimes already committed. The Holocaust had already consumed millions by the time Valkyrie was set in motion, and so their courage, though real, came when the scale of suffering had already reached its peak. The lesson here is sobering. Courage matters most when it is hardest, not when it is safest. Valkyrie therefore stands as both an inspiration and a warning. Moral action delayed is often moral opportunity lost. Another lesson of Valkyrie lies in the limits of resistance when facing a totalitarian system fortified by fear, propaganda, and violence. The conspirators had networks, plans, and even a moment of opportunity, but they lacked mass support. Hitler's control over the military, his cult of personality, and the pervasive presence of the Gestapo ensured that resistance would always remain fragmented. No matter how well planned, the coup's chance of success was strangled by a dictatorship that had perfected the art of suppressing dissent. Valkyrie teaches us that courage alone cannot topple tyranny. It must be paired with structures, unity, and timing that dictatorship deliberately prevents. This recognition does not diminish their bravery, but underscores the near impossibility of their task. In understanding their failure, we also understand the terrifying power of totalitarianism to isolate and break even the most determined resistors. Valkyrie is therefore a testament not only to human courage, but also to the crushing weight of political oppression. The conspirators also reveal the profound tension between loyalty and conscience in times of war. As officers of the Wehrmacht, they had sworn an oath of allegiance to Hitler, binding their honor and careers to the dictator's survival. Breaking that oath meant shattering the very foundation of their identity as soldiers, defying a tradition that equated obedience with duty. By turning against Hitler, they redefined loyalty, not as obedience to a leader, but as fidelity to the nation and to humanity itself. This redefinition carries timeless relevance, for it asks every generation where true loyalty lies in power or in principle. Valkyrie teaches us that real loyalty is not blind obedience but the willingness to resist when authority itself becomes criminal. It shows that conscience is the highest form of allegiance, transcending the narrow boundaries of military or political duty. The lesson remains sharp even today. Obedience can sustain tyranny, but conscience can defy it. From a broader perspective, Valkyrie also teaches about the fragility of freedom and the vigilance required to protect it. The conspirators lived in a society where dictatorship had eroded law, silenced opposition, and normalized brutality. Their attempt to resist emerged only after the full weight of tyranny had already crushed civil society, leaving them isolated. This illustrates a vital lesson. Resistance must begin before authoritarianism solidifies, for once the machinery of terror is in place, defiance becomes nearly impossible. The conspirators' struggle reminds us that liberty is not lost in one moment, but in many small concessions, each tolerated until resistance seems futile. Their courage came too late to save millions, but their story warns us to recognize tyranny in its infancy rather than in its maturity. Valkyrie therefore speaks across generations, urging vigilance in defense of freedom and an unwillingness to compromise with injustice. The global significance of Valkyrie lies in its testimony that even in the heart of Nazi Germany, conscience endured. For many outside Germany, the war painted the nation in shades of complicity, its people seen as willing followers of Hitler. The conspirators shattered this narrative, proving that pockets of defiance existed even within the Wehrmacht's highest ranks. Their failure does not diminish their importance, rather it magnifies the moral lesson that courage need not be victorious to be meaningful. Valkyrie reminds us that resistance, even when crushed, preserves dignity and offers a moral counter-narrative to tyranny. The conspirators' sacrifice tells the world that humanity's capacity for defiance persists even under the most brutal regimes. The lesson is not only about Germany's past but about the human condition, that courage and conscience can never be fully extinguished, no matter how powerful the oppressor. Valkyrie also raises enduring questions about the relationship between morality and pragmatism in political resistance. Some argue the conspirators acted too late, motivated not by compassion for victims, but by military desperation as defeat loomed. Others counter that their timing does not diminish the moral weight of their defiance, for to act at all in Hitler's Germany was an act of immense risk. This tension between motives and actions remains a central lesson of Valkyrie. It challenges us to consider whether the purity of motive is essential, or whether the act of resistance itself carries moral worth, regardless of timing. The conspirators, with all their flaws and complexities, remind us that history's moral actors are rarely saints, but human beings caught in impossible dilemmas. Valkyrie teaches us to see them not as perfect heroes, but as flawed men who nevertheless dared to act. Their imperfection makes their courage no less valuable. Indeed, it makes it more human, and therefore more instructive. Ultimately, the lessons of Valkyrie transcend the boundaries of World War II, offering timeless reflections on courage, morality, and the human spirit. The failed coup reminds us that tyranny can be resisted, even if not defeated, and that moral action has value, even when it does not succeed. It shows us that conscience, though fragile, can outlast oppression, leaving a legacy that shapes future generations. Valkyrie warns us of the dangers of silence and delay, but also inspires us with the example of men who chose defiance over complicity. Their failure does not make them irrelevant. It makes them universal, for most acts of resistance throughout history have been crushed before they triumphed. The conspirators' story endures because it affirms a simple truth that courage, even when it falls short, illuminates the path for those who follow. Valkyrie is thus not only a story of defeat, but a story of meaning, teaching us that the duty of resistance lies not in success but in the act itself.